Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto sacrifices himself for his mother. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. It's a father's job to protect his son. But if the father can do this job, the mother should be even better. Kushina gritted her teeth as she desperately held onto the ground on which she stood, with her hands tightly wrapped around the nine tails' enormous, elongated nails sticking through her stomach. The entire power of the colossal beast was being put behind the kunoichi in a futile attempt to run her through completely and impale its intended target. But even with its great size, its incomprehensible strength, and malicious, raw power that was enough to level landscapes, topple mountains and bring about great ocean calamities, despite all of this, the Kyuubi couldn't even budge a young mother protecting her newborn son. The redhead coughed out blood as her heels kicked into the dirt, using every last bit of strength she could fathom to prevent the Kyuubi from spearing her baby, who was lying asleep on the ceremonial throne that would be used to perform the 8 trigram seal. "Damn you!" the Kyuubi bellowed, attempting to withdraw its paw. However, it was unable to thanks to the chakra chains binding it tightening around his limbs, preventing the demon from moving. "You mongrel humans, I will kill you." Kushina chuckled and glanced over her shoulder, where she saw Minato standing directly behind her. Not only did she take the lethal blow meant for her son, but the fourth Hokage, her husband and their son's father, had also taken the hit. Now they were both impaled on the same talon, Kushina's back to her husband's chest, and both of them gripping the nail and the ground with all their might, preventing the Kyuubi from bringing any more harm to their son. "You win," the woman exclaimed, her voice hoarse from the effort of both holding back the pain and the nail gouging them. "First, pant. Argument you've ever won, Minato." "Pant. Guess you're really serious." Minato grinned. "Thank you, Kushina." Relinquishing a hand from the talon, the fourth Hokage held it out to the side, out of reach of the demon's paw. Summoning jutsu. A puff of white smoke formed a cloud beside the withering pair of shinobi, and once the fumes cleared, it revealed an impatient-looking toad with a rolled-up scroll encompassing its midsection. The lofty amphibian was at first cross at being summoned, but then when it looked up, its look of discontent turned into shock at the sight of a very familiar beast. "Gah, the 9 tails? And fourth? What the hell happened to you? Gamatora, I'm entrusting you with the key to the seal. Hurry to Jiraiya-sensei and store it with him," Minato stated, using whatever ounces of breath and energy he had left in his body to speak. In doing so, he unfurled the scroll around the toad's stomach and with his blood, painted in the necessary seals required for the transition from host to occur. Now that the ownership of the key was being changed, Minato knew immediately what needed to be done. He finished his scribbling with an affirmative nod, and with a relieved sigh his blood-soaked fingers fell away. The toad the fourth was addressing nodded in understanding and clapped its hands together. "Got it, goodbye, Minato." Gamatora disappeared the same way he arrived, a white cloud of smoke engulfing him and fading away seconds later. "That does it," Minato murmured, smiling in relief. He felt a sudden tug on his chakra, which was still being held captive by the dead demon-consuming seal hanging onto both him and the 9 tails chakra he had managed to store within him. The death god was growing impatient due to Minato's plummeting chakra levels still keeping him bound to this plane of reality, and with a low growl, yanked on Minato's imprisoned soul to let him know that his time was running out. The blonde village leader nodded in understanding and placed his hand on his wife's shoulder. "It's time for me to go, Kushina," Minato stated, his voice becoming even hoarser. "I'm going to perform the 8 trigram seal, and leave a bit of my chakra behind with Naruto, too." Kushina nodded and closed her eyes, tears welling up at the prospect of leaving her son alone. It pained her even more than the wound both herself and her husband were sharing to protect him. "There isn't much time left. If you have anything to say to Naruto, say it now." Kushina sighed and opened her eyes, revealing them to be heavily clouded with tears. When she looked down upon her sleeping son, safely out of harm's reach of the Kyuubi and the death it was wishing upon him, she smiled. "Naruto, don't be a fussy eater. Eat a lot and grow up to be a big boy. Take your bath every day, go to bed early and sleep well. Make friends, it doesn't matter how many, just make sure they're real friends, people you can trust, even if it is a few. And if you want to be a ninja someday, then, study your ninjutsu well." Kushina grinned at this vision, imagining how her son would probably be when he's older. I never really was good at it, but maybe you will be. Everyone has things they're good at and things they're not, so don't feel bad if you can't do it all. Make sure you listen to your teachers at the academy. At this point, both Minato and Kushina were smiling happily. And remember, avoid the 3 vices of shinobi. Don't borrow money if you can't help it, so save what you earn from missions. No drinking alcohol until you're 20, and don't overdo it or you'll ruin your body. And as for women, Kushina chuckled. Well, I'm a woman so I don't really know what to say, but there are only men and women in this world, and you'll want to have a girlfriend someday. Just, try not to pick a weird one. Try to find someone like your mother. The redhead then sighed and shook her head, an ever-present, unflinching grin on her face. And the 4th warning, watch out for Jiraiya-sensei. Minato couldn't help but share a light laugh at that, knowing full well what his master was like. They both did. Kushina smiled and cried at the same time. This was something she thought would never happen, something she didn't want to see or experience. But it happened. There was so much more she wanted to do, so many years in a life she wanted to spend with her husband and her son. She wanted to watch her son grow up, teach him, hold him, and hug and kiss him, to love him, just like a mother would. She wanted to spend time with Minato and Naruto as a family, to laugh together, to play together and have breakfast, lunch and dinner whenever they could together. To her, and probably to Minato as well, there was just so much more that they could have done. So much that she just couldn't comprehend what their lives would have been like if the events that had transpired just a few hours ago had been different. They could have spent a lifetime together. But life was cruel. The man that had maliciously taken away their chance to be a family together was still alive and out there somewhere, witnessing all of this happening. The thought that she couldn't do anything about it made her sick to her stomach, and she couldn't even think about the idea of her son facing that man and the world out there all alone. Even if it meant sacrificing more than herself, Kushina was not going to let Naruto suffer the same fate she and Minato were. I think, it's time. The 4th glanced at his wife with a puzzled look, wondering what she could mean by that. Relinquishing her left hand from the Nine-Tails' talon, she reached out and took Naruto's right hand in hers. With the blood she had on her finger, she began tracing markings all along his fingers, his palm, and then his arm. All the while, she felt his little hand twitch under her gentle touch. When she was done, she took his hand in hers and gently held it. Tears streamed down her face as she held onto her sleeping child. That's, Minato blinked in surprise. The first, and possibly the last thing I will ever teach him, Minato, Kushina smiled. It's my village's legacy, my clan's most powerful jutsu, and my gift to him. It will protect him. The 4th Hokage watched as the seals Kushina drew on Naruto's arm suddenly glowed a brilliant, bright blue, signifying that chakra was flooding into his arm. It then vanished seconds later, along with the markings and the blood. The sight made the village leader smile and with an affirmative nod of his head, leaned in and pressed his cheek up against his wife's, who was still smiling. Naruto, you're going to experience a lot of pain and suffering, Kushina said, trying to hold back all the tears she could, but was unable to. Remember who you are, find a goal, find a dream, and don't ever stop trying till it comes true. Sniff. There's so much more I want to say, so much more I want to teach you, I want to stay with you. I love you. Minato blinked, also on the verge of tears himself. But he had to remain firm and rigid. It was what a father should be. Cough. I'm sorry Minato. I took up all our time, Kushina cried. It's okay, Minato murmured, and looked down at his son. Naruto, this is your dad. A grin spread across his face. Listen, to your motormouth mother. The little Naruto seemed to smile and murmur, rolling a bit in his cradle as if he had heard and understood everything his parents had said to him. This was all the sign Minato and Kushina needed to know that their son had been listening. Even if he didn't understand it now, he would later on in life. Their words and their sacrifice would not be in vain. Late morning. In the time since the Kyuubi's attack on the village, Konohagakure had become a pillar of strength and courage throughout the Land of Fire. An example that all other villages and allied nations wanted to follow. The smaller nations neighboring the country had often looked towards the village hidden in the leaves for support in times of dire stress and great hardship. This balance held between Konoha and its smaller allies helps to maintain a stable and steady economic flow between them, and allows them to resolve disputes quickly without quarrels. However, accompanying these years of peace and prosperity, Konoha has still been plagued by a different, constant, natural disaster. Get back here! A ninja shouted angrily as he rushed past startled civilians down a random dirt road in pursuit of his highly elusive quarry. You're gonna pay for what you've done, Naruto. Haha, you will have to catch me first, the spiky-haired blonde in question replied, quickly making a sharp turn and sprinting down a narrow alleyway to evade his pursuers. The paint bucket he was holding tightly at his side thrashed about as a result of his wild movements, creating a bright and colorful trail of contemporary patterns over the ground that he covered. Though it wasn't inconvenient for him, it did leave an incredibly obvious path for his pursuers to follow. The shinobi chasing the child violently pushed past several civilians, accidentally knocking someone carrying groceries over to make the hard corner necessary for him to keep pace with his fleeing mark. Of course, in this village, civilians seeing or encountering shinobi running around wasn't a rare sight at all. In fact, it was such a common sight that people could go about their daily lives without the fear of being assassinated. But seeing Anbu out, in broad daylight, and using the roads like a normal person, was actually quite a spectacle to the villagers. There is one, absolute prerequisite that all Anbu units had to follow above all others, saying that they are not to be seen in the eyes of the public or by regular shinobi forces unless orders dictated this law. However, the particular target this Anbu was currently in pursuit of was forcing him to break all his rules in order to bring him in. As soon as he had skidded to a halt at the entrance to the alleyway, the elite Jonin with brown hair and wearing a cat mask continued his hunt, intent on capturing the little troublemaker and ending this god-awful chase around town. Meanwhile, overhead, the ninja's partner followed and observed the pursuit closely from the rooftops, jumping from tree to tree and balcony to balcony, all in an effort to keep a lock on the nuisance boy causing them so many problems. Damn it, Naruto. I'm not going to say it again. Stop, the man in the mask yelled as he sprinted down the alley. Naruto grinned back over his shoulder and stuck his tongue out. You're an idiot if you think you can follow me. Spinning around in mid-run, the blonde knocked several trash cans over. The racket blocked the route of the Anbu with annoying clutter that bought the boy probably several seconds, with the noise of the cascading cylinders also startling a cat, who leapt across the way and up over the fence. Upon obstructing his pursuer's path with whatever he could, Naruto leapt back around and continued his sprint, unhampered by his brief task. He took a sharp right and continued running down a random road out of sight. The Anbu chasing him leapt over the trash cans with little effort and broke back into a hard sprint with no wasted movement, all in an effort to keep an eye on his swift prey. You'll have to do better than that, Gaki. The man barked. However, just as he was within reach of the exit, his foot suddenly caught onto something invisible and he tripped. Though he managed to catch himself in his fall to the muddy ground, he failed to notice the series of paint buckets lined up on the windowsill high above, which the wire he had disturbed was fixed to topple. The cans of red, green, pink and yellow fell rhythmically from their established point, and bombarded the Anbu with all the fruitiest colors you could imagine. The man's back and head ended up a splattered, colorful mess. Within moments of the domino effect ending, his dark uniform found itself decorated in a stunning parrot pattern, which would surely turn some heads back at HQ. However, his new look didn't appeal to him that much, nor did he get much of a chance to get a first impression of himself when the pink paint bucket landed on his head. When the last of the pails fell, the Anbu was seeing red. But it wasn't in the tone given to him by the unexpected shower. Clenching his fists and trembling angrily, the man leapt to his feet and unleashed a primal roar. Ripping the paint can off of his head, he chucked it at the wall. God damn it! Naruto laughed when he heard the man's cry. Sucker! His renewed run down another of the main roads of Konohagakure went on unheeded from that point onwards, as he boldly dodged traffic and stalls left and right. Despite the complexity of his path, the route seemed to come naturally to him, with villagers watching from the sidelines as he slid right under a pane of glass being moved across the road, hurdled a wagon of barrels, ducked below a man moving a crate and leapt over a wide puddle. It was a sporting wonder. But it was not to last. His run hit no potholes in his successful navigation of all the other obstacles, right up to the point when his path was predictably blocked by the other participant of the merry marathon. Naruto looked ahead to see his other Anbu pursuer leap down from the rooftops and land directly in the middle of his course. Arms folded, the woman with the purple hair, wielding a katana and wearing a different cat mask to her partner, smirked from behind her porcelain face at the youngster approaching her. "Give it up, kid," the woman exclaimed. "You can't get past me." Naruto smirked in response to his adversary's statement and, as if it were as normal as breathing, he instinctively chucked the paint can he was holding at the woman full pelt, with his throw backed up by the momentum of his run. Catch! The tin of white paint spiraled through the air towards the Anbu unit it was aimed for. However, just before it hit her, the masked woman swiftly raised her hand and caught it, a feat that would have been quite impossible for a normal person at the distance. Nice try, but, splat, the top of the pail suddenly went off and painted her entire mask with white sludge. The exploding, thick liquid managed to get through the holes punched into her porcelain visor, and the woman got the shock of her life when she found her whole world clouded by white. Yugo dropped the now half a paint can and staggered backwards, trying to clear her eyes out but couldn't due to her accursed face wear. "Shit, Arg, you, damn you annoying brat," Yugo roared, flailing her arms out aimlessly to try and catch the boy, only for the spiky-haired Jinchuriki to slip right between her legs and carry on running past her. He put a piece of an exploding tag inside the can and rigged it to blow when it mixed with the contents. Damn it, once again, Naruto had effortlessly evaded the elite of Konohagakure. Naruto. 50. Anbu chumps. Not dat bayo, Naruto exclaimed, and after a brief glance back at the stumbling shinobi, sprinted down the road at full speed. Nothing would stop him now. He was in the clear and he could see it. The west gates of Konohagakure hung wide open, and from where he was to it, there was absolutely zero traffic. The blonde hollered out a triumphant yell and ran on, kicking up a cloud of dust at the speed he achieved. Then, finally, after making a record-breaking 800-meter dash to freedom, the spiky-haired academy student leapt through the air and spun around. His heels slammed into the ground and he slid to a stop all cool style, just millimeters from crossing the threshold leading to the world beyond Konoha's walls. Quadruple AND. Grinning widely, the blonde threw his arms up and laughed out loud. Saw AAFE. Haha, Naruto bellowed. Katetsu and Izumo, the two Chunins who were on gate duty that morning, smiled when they saw the kid arrive. Their morning had been pretty much routine, boring and peaceful, with little to no civilians entering and exiting the village. It had been relatively quiet until the walking energy tank arrived. However, unlike other arrivals, this arrival had been anticipated by the two slackers, and after watching the runner touch the white line, Katetsu clicked on the stopwatch he was holding at his side and looked down at it. Izumo meanwhile, was gazing intently over the counter to where the boy's feet were touching. The man with the bandana slapped his hand on the desk in front of him. It's a goal. His feet didn't touch the line. No penalties. His hands swept out in both directions, like a ref calling a goal. The Jinchuriki, clad in orange trousers, a dark blue shirt, sandals, an orange flak jacket tied around his waist and with goggles slapped across his forehead, turned towards the border post after his victory yell and grinned at the two Chunin. "So, how did I do today?" Naruto asked eagerly. Katetsu whistled, scratching his head. "It was close, but you broke your previous record," the Chunin exclaimed, taking out a folded-up piece of paper from his pocket, and as soon as he had opened it began scribbling over it. "From when the whistle blew to the finish line, your previous time was 45 minutes and 55 seconds. Today, you got 43 minutes and 21 seconds. Congratulations, Yata." Naruto leapt in the air, pumping a fist in the air at the same time. "I'm getting stronger." "Ah, don't go jumping around just yet. Your overall score also depends on the participants of this prestigious event," Izumo informed, taking the paper Katetsu was holding and getting a closer look at it. Apparently, the chase Naruto across the entire village by random shinobi had become an almost Olympic-like sport to the two Chunin. Not only were they keeping tabs on the boys' score, but they were also running a betting pool with several of their companions back at HQ. Most of these other patrons were additional border guards and shinobi who have heard of the daily event. Izumo smiled at the sheet he held. "The time you got before was an hour something and you were chased by two Chunin. The day after, you were pursued by 3 Chunin for 57 minutes and 46 seconds, after that, 7 Chunin and you got an hour, 10 minutes and 42 seconds, mostly due to more participants. Not to mention an old man who got in my way," Naruto stated proudly, giving them the thumbs up. Boy, I got him good. Yeah, now that was good craftsmanship. Kotetsu grinned widely after his amused exclamation and shook his head. I've never seen a pallet of eggs used so artistically before. Moving on, Azumo cleared his throat. Later, you were chased by a dozen chunin, after that 2 jonin, and, let's see, The latest chase involved 2 chunin and an anbu, Azumo marked it. That anbu had a bird mask, so I'm guessing it was Kazuki. What were the masks you saw today? Naruto rubbed his chin in thought and looked away, scrunching his face up in concentration. Let's see, there were 3 chunin at first, but I lost them in the flash bomb route, and 2 anbu. Naruto said, holding up 5 to indicate the total number. One had a cat mask with 3 whiskers on each side, and another had a feral cat mask, with 1 line on each cheek and 1 on the forehead. Naruto drew the invisible definitions over his face in his description of his pursuers. Wow, you got 2 good ones, Azumo affirmed, scribbling down the names. Today, it was Tenzo and Yugo. Man, is she going to be pissed. He glanced over at his partner with a grin. The man with the bandage over his nose smirked back. So, who won the pot today? Kotetsu asked curiously, pulling up another sheet and looking at the polls provided. I had 2,000 on 50 minutes with 3 anbu. And I had 3,000 on 45 with 1 anbu and 2 jonin. I'm not sure. I think Genma came the closest with a bid of 4 for 40-something with 2 anbu and 3 chunin, Kotetsu informed, going over the secondary piece of paper several times. After confirming his report, he then looked back up at the Jinchuriki and smiled. Good on ya today, kid. You should be proud of yourself. The boy in question grinned back and gave the 2 gate guards the thumbs up. Naruto enjoyed causing mayhem and mischief around the village because of the amount of attention it got him. It didn't just consist of bad impressions that came of infuriating the entire populace. It also got him some recognition and respect, even if it was in small amounts. To him, these minuscule doses of ego boosters felt like great gifts to him, ones that he took to heart and helped him get through the days of loneliness back at home. Among the few appraisers that existed in the village, there were Kotetsu and Azumo, both of who were some of the only people Naruto genuinely liked. The young Jinchuriki viewed these 2 chunin as senseis, both of whom returned this respect likewise, viewing him as a boy with great potential. To them, he wasn't an outcast. They viewed him as a promising shinobi candidate from the academy and a good friend, who spends most of his time slacking off and pulling wool over the village's eyes. So, what did you trash this time to piss off the local guard? Azumo asked curiously. Naruto grinned and pointed straight down the road and up a little. The 2 chunin leaned over the counter to take a look at what his focus for today was, and got the shock of a lifetime when they saw what the youngster had actually done. Just several inches up from where they could see the Hokage mansion on the horizon, the cage faces carved into the side of Konoha's mountain, were painted in a whole new light this morning. A lather of contemporary patterns of white, yellow, pink and red covered their once serious expressions, making them an almost satire image of what they once were. I mean, how could you not laugh at the third with a nosebleed and a streak of pink across his cheeks? It fitted his personality perfectly. I'm not cleaning that up, Kotetsu murmured, before smirking seconds later. Very funny, Azumo choked back a laugh and craned his head ever so slightly, as he analyzed the 4 faces individually. Your composition is okay, but you may want to work in the soft brush into the more definitive areas of curvatures. It stands out more from this distance. Naruto laughed and placed his hands on his hips, standing dead center of the road and grinning proudly up at his creation. All across the village, the 3 of them could hear the cries of anguish and despair, as well as the calls from random civilians of, who could have done such a thing? The morning quickly descended into a whirlpool of chaos, and Naruto was certain that old man Hiruzen Sarutobi was already up on the roof of his mansion, intent on assessing the situation and finding the culprit. But this wasn't an attack from a shinobi nation, a rogue ninja, or anything of the sort. It was an attack from a bored child with an axe to grind. Those suckers. It can't get much better than this. No, it can't. Naruto nearly jumped out of his skin when he heard that familiar voice speak up from behind him. A terrified look crossing his face and sweat breaking out like a waterfall, the blonde slowly turned his head about and gulped. Glancing up ever so slightly, the young teen saw none other than Iruka Amino standing directly behind him, arms folded, finger tapping impatiently against his bicep, and quite literally with smoke rising from his head as he scowled down at his student. Despite his impatient expression though, he was far beyond the point of annoyed. This didn't sit too well with Naruto. This time, he was certain he was going to get the death penalty. Thought you could get away with it, huh you little runt? Naruto grinned sheepishly as he desperately thought of a way out of his predicament. Running wasn't an option and fighting was out of the question. Iruka was able to floor him in light sparring during outdoor sessions and didn't even have to try, and right now, when he was this pissed, coaxing a little duel out of the academy teacher would inevitably mean he would end up face down in the mud. Naruto wasn't that stupid. Looking over at Kotetsu and Izumo and hoping for some assistance, the blonde inexplicably saw that the pair had resumed going about their usual business. They were nonchalantly filing their nails and whistling random, tone-deaf tunes as they aimlessly looked around their safe little box on the side of the road for something to do. At this point, Naruto's confidence and respect for the two just plummeted. He took back everything nice he said about them. They were absolutely useless, particularly when he was in a crisis and needed bailing out and they weren't. Cowards. Naruto turned back to face his teacher with a nervous grin. Gee, good morning, Iruka-sensei. I have no idea what you could be talking about. Oh, I think you do know what I'm talking about. You'd better have a damn good explanation for missing today's morning lectures and revision classes, Naruto, Iruka breathed, before jabbing his finger in the direction of the Hokage monument and the miserable state it was in. And it better not be anything to do with that. Oh, well, sensei, I wasn't skipping class on purpose. No, not at all. There were, extenuating circumstances that I had to, desperately attend to. Naruto exclaimed, before turning to the two Chunin sitting back in the guard box. Isn't that right, Kotetsu-sensei? Izumo-sensei? The shinobi inside the gate station stopped doing what they were doing and looked over at Naruto with subtle, sly grins on their faces. They shrugged back indignantly at the stares the two individuals in front of them were throwing them, hoping to throw off any blame or involvement. Nope, have no idea what you're talking about, Naruto, Kotetsu replied, picking his ear. Iruka furrowed his brow and looked down at Naruto to see the boy grinning up at him and fidgeting nervously. The Chunin studied the Jinchuriki's expression several times, raising an eyebrow before gazing back up at his fellow shinobi companions sitting lazily in their booth. He repeated this action several times, his annoyance growing all the more. If none of them were going to fess up willingly, then his only choice left was to wheedle the evidence necessary for him to make the rational decision out of them. Either of them would do. So, what was the bid I made on the run for Naruto this morning? Iruka asked. I don't think you made a bid, Irufuck. Kotetsu dropped the paper he brought up and clamped his mouth shut, while Izumo sighed and slapped his forehead. Caught. You blew it, mate, thanks a bunch. Iruka scowled at them and jabbed a finger in their direction. In class, his single digit was a force to be reckoned with. He could use it to exile a person from the room or make their life a living hell. For the two Chunin, it was most likely the latter. I'm going to have a word with the Hokage about this. All of this, Iruka said with a dangerous tone lacing his voice, before wheeling back around on Naruto, who was still grinning nervously up at him, but looking even more worried than before. His arms still folded, the Chunin pursed his lips angrily and furrowed his brow even more, his scar wrinkling up as a result. And as for you, minutes later, back at the academy, what a rip-off, Naruto shouted, kicking away on the hardwood floor at the front of the classroom with his whole body except for his legs bound by rope. False arrest, sensei. You got the wrong man. HMPH. I'm sure I can recognize your handiwork, Naruto, even from a long way away, Iruka replied, while smirking down at the tied-up troublemaker propped down on the floor like a show-and-tell item. After all, I grade your tests on a weekly basis. Naruto huffed and looked away, his actions earning a round of laughs from all of the students in the classroom sitting up in the rows of desks. Though it didn't discourage the blonde one bit, it did irk him something fierce, and he just stuck his tongue up at both his sensei and the students that laughed. The scar-faced Chunin sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose, before glaring down at the kid again and pointing at him accusingly. Tomorrow is the Shinobi Academy's graduation exam, and you've failed it the past 2 times, Naruto. Iruka stated in a loud voice, silencing any more laughter and wiping any grins off of the onlooking students' faces. This isn't the time to be playing around or causing trouble. Naruto scoffed. Blah, whatever. Steaming with frustration, Iruka snapped. He slammed his foot into the floor and rounded on the students up in the stands, pointing at the empty space to his left. It's your lucky day, cadets. Practical henge no jutsu test. Everyone line up. I expect you all to transform into perfect versions of me. The Chunin's shouting startled everyone, even the more docile students. The uncomfortable whine from Akamaru sitting atop of Kiba's head could be heard around the classroom. The feral-looking boy wearing the jacket and with the signature red markings under his eyes petted his companion to comfort him. Shish, it's okay boy. It's just the teacher. The students wasted no time scurrying down the stairways to the front of the class. Once Naruto had been unbound and had taken his place somewhere at the middle end of the line, Iruka then began systematically testing each potential graduate that came up. Clipboard in hand, he methodically ticked off and marked the quality of each individual henge transformation, making note of the slightest details, right down to the position of the scar on his mirror image's nose. Most of the students did well, with the more adept ones earning a smile from the desk-grown teacher. Meanwhile, as the lineup proceeded round one person at a time, Naruto stood somewhere in the middle, hands on his hips and looking disgruntled. The same could be said about a couple of the other students standing behind and in front of him. Ino Yamanaka, one of the other well-renowned blondes of the class, stood behind him, and was looking just as displeased as everybody else. She roughly nudged the one responsible for their predicament in the shoulder, causing him to stumble a bit. This whole thing is your fault, you know, Naruto, the girl jabbed disapprovingly. Like I care, the boy rebutted, glancing over his shoulder in displeasure. You hardly see me around the classroom anyway. Why do you care if you get to take some of the heat once a month? Because it's mainly you or Kiba that gets us into trouble, you idiot, Ino hissed back, placing a hand on his head and trying to squeeze his brains out. The Jinchuriki squirmed unnervingly. Somebody needs to take the blame. Yeah, well, Naruto picked the hand up off of his skull and glared back at her. It's not like I can do anything you guys can do. You're all so special. The youngster said this with quite a bit of spite and jealousy dripping off of his tongue. Ino smirked and folded her arms. Because the rest of us listen in class, while you're an idiot and a slacker. What else can we expect? Naruto chose to ignore her following that remark. After several more students were called up and marked off, it was then Naruto's turn on the grandstand. Iruka watched as the boy stepped forward and assumed both the necessary stance and the hand seal required for him to execute the jutsu. Frowning, the boy closed his eyes and concentrated. He knew the process well. The steps required him to gather chakra and expand it to encompass his entire body in order for the transformation to take place. He also had to keep it at a constant emission state to maintain the form of the person he was supposed to be imitating, in this case, Iruka Amino. The man wasn't that hard to copy after all. The blonde knew him from back to front. It was easy. As soon as he formed the seal, Naruto began putting his knowledge of the most basic academy technique into practice. He gathered the chakra at the center of his body like he was taught. And that was about as far as he got. Sweat broke out on his face as he pushed harder and harder. However, the chakra in his system refused to move, mold or take any shape or form. It was as if it was being restrained. The boy gritted his teeth as he tried to force his chakra out, but all he got was white noise. After a few seconds, however, his efforts to bring about a proper henge was accompanied by the sounds of the other students snickering in the background at his obvious turmoil. You wuss. It's not that difficult to do a simple henge, Kiba exclaimed, with Akamaru barking lightly from his perch atop of his master's head. At that statement, more laughter made its way out into the open, as the students continued to watch Naruto struggle. What a loser. Iruka watched on, growing steadily impatient at Naruto's inability to bring about a transformation. That impatience grew even more over the next minute, and after that minute ticked by, the blonde still hadn't attained any results. Letting out a breath of air, the teacher clicked his pen and marked Naruto off, at the same time putting a big fat F right next to his name. Sorry Naruto, Iruka stated, looking up at the kid to see him still fighting with the technique. If you're going to continue messing around, then you won't get anywhere even with the simplest of technique. But I'm trying, Iruka-sensei. Naruto shouted, finally throwing in the towel and turning towards the scarred Chunin with a distressed look on his face. I've seen the technique done 1,000 times and I've listened to what you've said in class. But I just can't do it myself. I know what to do. I know what I have to do. I just can't do it. Iruka frowned at the distraught kid and lowered both his pad and pen. You should be able to do the technique, Naruto, the Chunin informed, hands on his hips. Look, you've had your chakra balance checked over at the hospital dozens of times. I've read the reports from the doctors myself. You're fine. There's absolutely no reason why you can't do it. But I can't. That's the problem, sensei. Naruto almost cried out, gesturing to the spot he was standing in before. At the same time he stepped towards his instructor. It's not just the henge technique, but I can't even do any of the escape jutsu or clone techniques that you taught me. It's just not fair. The whole prospect of being unable to perform a single jutsu was digging in deep, and it was really showing on his expression, posture and by how his voice was climbing in both volume and tone. Iruka observed tears brimming at Naruto's eyes and sighed heavily, shaking his head. Look, I'm sorry, Naruto. But if you can't do any of the required jutsu by tomorrow's exam, then I'm afraid I'm going to have to fail you, Iruka replied, shrugging in disappointment. As much as it pained him to let his student down, he had no choice. You may have passed your physical fitness with flying colors, and barely scraped by on your stealth and taijutsu basics, but you've still done poorly in your final shuriken jutsu test and most of your theory work. Being unable to complete your basics in academy jutsu practices, your final score will ultimately fall behind in the academy aggregate required for graduation by 10 points. Naruto was a good kid when he wanted to be. He worked just as hard as everybody else when he wasn't skipping class, and he was competent in some areas. His taijutsu was fair, his stealth was pretty good during the formative tests, but he was always fooling about and acting flamboyant during the actual exams, and his physical fitness was far above any of the other students. Nevertheless, throughout all his years of schooling, the blonde has been unable to perform any ninjutsu. Even gathering chakra proved to be too much for him. If he couldn't perform a technique when his body could, then failing him was the best option. Hearing what Iruka had to say, what little hope and encouragement Naruto had in him just disappeared. The boy frowned deeply in a combination of both aggravation and displeasure. With an angry growl, he turned heel and just legged it out of the classroom. He left a concerned Iruka and an amused room of students behind as he took to the hallways, and then to the outside world as soon as he was out the doors of the academy. Later that day, Hokage's office. He's a good student, Hokage-sama, but I just sigh. If he can't perform the clone jutsu by tomorrow, then I can't pass him, Iruka explained, his eyes falling on the back of the third Hokage's seat while the village leader was staring out the window. I don't see how he can possibly survive out there in the real world when he can't even perform a single jutsu successfully or focus long enough to ensure good team competence or results on missions. Even though I've explained the concepts to him over 100 times, he may understand the processes, but he can't follow through with them. Hiruzen Sarutobi remained quiet after the Chunin finished his report on his most well-recognized student. Even though it wasn't a student who was a genius or the most talented, it was still a student everyone knew very well, someone whom Iruka had taken so much time out of his busy schedule to approach the esteemed village leader about. From the way he described the situation and what his ultimate decision was in regards to the boy's progression, he sounded incredibly concerned. The third pulled his pipe out from his pocket and plopped the tip in his mouth. Lighting it and breathing in deeply, the elder took more time to contemplate the entire story as he filled the air with the smell of tobacco, while Iruka waited behind the desk patiently for his greatest mentor to deliberate on his words. All the units in the shinobi forces expected Hiruzen to make immediate, calculated decisions on resolving issues, particularly on the more minor of matters. Nevertheless, despite having had this job for far longer than any of his predecessors, the old man liked to take his time mulling over information in his head. He had learned from experience that in the most stressful of times, even when those times were narrowed down to a last-minute reflection, still required a certain amount of time to think about. And unlike Iruka with his rather brash conclusion on the subject, the third still felt he was overlooking something. Minutes ticked by and Iruka was given no answer, not even a murmur or indication that his existence was recognized by the most esteemed village elder. However, after giving the subject in question further reflection, With some more window gazing as a focal point, the old Hokage eventually did come up with something he noticed that Iruka had missed. It was a crucial detail that even he felt needed evaluation. How did young Naruto paint the entire Hokage monument without anybody noticing till he had finished? Pardon? And how did he manage to get over the side of that mountain without expending any chakra whatsoever for assistance? An elevation like that would require a rather complex mechanism that would surely have been noticed. Obviously, the cleaning platform hadn't been lowered or tampered with in the slightest during his little escapade, and the stone faces certainly weren't damaged by any grappling equipment. So, how was he able to accomplish such a feat, without any help and while the sun was peeking over the horizon? Iruka blinked, a little bit dumbfounded. Hiruzen chuckled, blowing smoke rings into the air at the same time. Furthermore, he was able to give some of my best shinobi the chase of a lifetime around the entire village for over half an hour. Ample time for even an adept chunin to have bagged a regular genin in a similar situation. Heck, he even managed to evade all attempts made by the Anbu to capture him, to the point where he would have cleared the village gates and defenses without getting caught, and would have been out of the country by, saw I. Midday, the third stated, removing the pipe from his mouth and tapping it on the side, sending excess ash flying. Such agility, energy, speed and skill should not be overlooked. But, Hokage-sama, the chunin stood, a little bit baffled. After seeing their most treasured and well-recognized monument vandalized by an academy student, Iruka thought that the Hokage would have been far more furious than he was. However, he wasn't furious at all. The Hokage was in fact laughing at the idea. Also, to have seen the results personally after the fiasco, the images didn't shake him in the least. He was pleased? What kind of madness was this? These skills more than make up for what he lacks in talent for ninjutsu and genjutsu. Iruka. Hiruzen spun around in his chair and looked up at the young man, who stood to attention the moment the village leader turned to face him. You say he does poorly in school, and that his jutsu skills aren't all that up to scratch for some unknown reason. Yet you also say he tries his hardest and that he is extremely passionate about becoming a shinobi. From what he has shown to be capable of, even if they were merely fun and games, don't you think that has earned him enough credit to pass your expectations for a genin? Iruka sighed and scratched his head, taking a bit more time to look about in contemplation of this added information. True, he overlooked Naruto's many adventures of mischief around Konohagakure, mostly due to the fact that they had been catastrophic to the village and to those around him. He had even completely overshot the debacle from months ago when Naruto was chased down by 3 enemy kunoichi, who were after an intelligence piece on a kunai he had found in the forest. Though he had managed to stall them using a vast assortment of material from his box of tricks till reinforcements arrived, those tricks and maneuvers wouldn't have been considered as legitimate, or standard, shinobi material and tactics in a school grading system. Nevertheless, it was a success in its own right and he was able to get away with it. Not to mention all of his other escapes he had made from the clutches of skilled chunin and jonin sent after him on a day-to-day basis after he'd vandalized and rigged up several iconic areas of importance around the village. Looking back on it, all those accomplishments were admittedly quite impressive. He's a little, slippery troublemaker that high-class shinobi all too often underestimate. I'll give him that. Iruka had to smile a bit and look back up at the Hokage. He definitely has the potential to cause the enemy quite a bit of grief. Although, I'm still a bit worried that his eccentric behavior might compromise a mission. Why not give him another chance, Iruka? Hiruzen suggested, shrugging his shoulders. I'm not asking you to pass him on the knowledge of his past antics, but just to test him on different grounds. He's obviously a smart student that isn't as disciplined like the others in following standard procedures. Maybe approaching him in a different way will help you reach a more reasonable verdict. Iruka nodded. The third always knew what to say to ease his mind and troubled conscience. Dealing with children at the academy day in and day out really stressed him out. He needed to clear his head. Sounds fair, the chunin agreed with a smile. Thank you for your time, Hokage-sama. The man bowed to the elder and turned to leave. Just as Iruka was reaching for the door of the room, he heard the elder clear his throat. Hiruzen quickly followed this up with more words. Words that were intended for Iruka's ears alone. Remember Iruka, the Hokage began, his expression falling back onto its usual, stern look to convey his seriousness of the situation. 2 years ago, you also passed a student who couldn't use ninjutsu or genjutsu at all. I believe his name was. Hiruzen added to this with a tap of his pipe against his chin and a shy-away glance of thought. Rock Lee. Iruka blinked, remembering the name of that particular student. If memory served him well, that boy was just as eccentric and determined as Naruto. I recall that his sensei was exactly the same as he was years ago, only he underestimated his abilities more to the point he stuck to only one form of shinobi conduct and discipline. The village leader continued, and allowed a smile to drift over his lips again. Food for thought. Iruka looked at his feet temporarily, pondering over this new information given, before he eventually stepped out of the office. After school hours, behind the academy, following the locking up of the classrooms he had attended during the day, Iruka took some more time off to wander about to think. His conversation with the third had given him a bit more of an insight as to what Naruto could actually accomplish outside of the academy. Even though theoretical and practical work in the academy counted significantly towards graduation, he still had a slightly open window to accept out-of-school work. Naruto was definitely a special candidate when it came to practical work outside of the margins of the schooling system. The Chunin concluded that he had to look away from the boy's various test sheets and marks taken during classes, in order to gain a better understanding the youngster's potential. Strolling around on the grounds outside of the academy, Iruka allowed his thoughts to wander on Naruto's past behavior and accomplishments, as this was his main focus and concern for the day. The boy's personality and antics pretty much outweighed everything else, even some of his most notable accomplishments, such as his continued increase in taijutsu prowess and excessive use of energy, in addition to his above high-standard physical fitness. He was a student who put matter before mind in an appropriate manner, but put the mind aspect a little too far behind him. Obviously, Naruto's attention span during lessons was as low as Shikamaru's, except Shikamaru didn't do too well in practical work aside from having an appropriate aim, but had terrible timing consistency in that respect. Naruto more than made up for that in consistency, speed and strength. There was just so much for Iruka to take in that he was having trouble coming up with a suitable verdict that would satisfy both him and Naruto. He wasn't going to pass Naruto without good reason. That much was made clear to him in his conversation with the third. But why can't he use ninjutsu? I don't understand. Iruka shook his head, deeply troubled by this note. His medical results show that he has chakra there, which means it can be harnessed somehow. But why can't it be manifested? Could he really be like Lee? He gritted his teeth as he thought harder. He's young, he's childish, and he doesn't fully understand how the world works. How can he survive out there on his own when the situation calls for it, and how will he fare when he's placed on a team for that matter? He's just too difficult. The man looked up as his thoughts raged away inside of his head. He began to think a bit more logically and seriously, and also started exploring deeper into the other aspects about the character in question. But, then again, there are kids his age that go out there all the time. Some of them I consider to be equal to his level or even far less competent in comparison. Tisk, Iruka chuckled briefly. Despite his childishness and his failings, he was able to run rings around our best shinobi. He's also lived on his own for most of his life as a Jinchuriki, hated, taunted and ridiculed by everyone, with no one to look after him or teach him these important things about life and fighting. He doesn't even know who he is, and yet he's survived with only a handful of useful skills. Hey, while Iruka worked over the debate in his head, he suddenly became aware of the sounds of distant yelling and loud thumping noises. Blinking as he was stirred from his world of contemplation, he set his sights on the wooded area beside the playground. Looking around briefly and keeping an ear open for the clamor, the Chunin then began making his way towards the source of the sounds. Stepping off of the footpath, he pushed his way through the brush he encountered around the wooded area, which quickly led him to an open space. Peering round a tree standing in his way, Iruka sprouted a look of surprise when he spotted Naruto sparring away against a large tree stump situated in the middle of the clearing. Making sure he kept out of sight, the older shinobi decided to stay and watch his student for a bit. So this is where he goes after he runs off? Iruka blinked, recalling some of the other times Naruto had fled the classroom out of either frustration or distress. Naruto was working his fists and kicks into the sides of the large log like it was a training dummy, yelling out with every blow he landed. The style he used wasn't an academy approach, but more of a mixture between it and an unusual form of combat Iruka recognized, which best suited his build. He struck with power hits that were swift and consistent, and visibly cracked and shook the large stump with the amount of force put behind every swing. He also compensated for the wider hits with quick strikes and jabs that also acted as a defense for his center, which he mixed in with his more accentuated attacks. His style then became more elaborate, as he began moving around the object of his attention, jumping high to land kicks and punches in the upper parts of the log. He danced rings around the stump, before eventually stopping with his right fist barely hovering over the surface of the trunk. His last punch looked strong, but he stopped at the last second. Iruka became puzzled by why he ceased, but found out soon enough when he saw Naruto's fist begin to tremble and his calm expression held from when he was fighting suddenly transform into one of anger. Naruto glared at his fist for a full minute, before bringing it back and begin ruthlessly laying it into the tree. He jabbed and punched at the log with all his might, literally plowing a hole right through to the center, shattering the wood. When it collapsed, he then focused attention on another buffer, this time a fully grown tree standing away from the middle of the clearing, and began slamming his fists into that one as well. "Why, failure?" Naruto shouted between each punch, bringing the whole trunk down shortly after and moving on to another. "Why, do I suck?" Bringing down 2 more trees, the Jinchuriki then turned to another one and, bringing his right fist around, sent it straight across in a wide hook. "Why can't I do it?" His cry was added with a loud crash as his hook went straight through the tree, sending chunks of wood and splinters flying through the air. That mighty blow sent the tree collapsing right on top of another, just as all the others had after suffering the youngster's wrath. The boy sobbed out in both hurt and anger as he stumbled around. He turned his attention back to the collapsed stump he had been working on before. Approaching it, he picked it up and literally hurled it into the treetops, moments before falling to the ground himself. There he stayed and wept, ignoring the fact that his fists were cut up and bleeding badly. Iruka was at first shocked that the boy was able to bring down 6 trees on his own with his bare hands successively. He was then shocked in a different way when he saw the boy begin to cry and step back a little as he watched. In all the years he had known the boy, Iruka had always considered Naruto as a steel pillar, one that was not so easily broken or damaged. Sure, he would be swayed by the bellowing wind once or twice, but the boy quite frequently if not always came off as bright, cheerful, happy, and childish. However, what Iruka failed to realize up till that moment was that all he had been seeing on the young boy's face was a mask. Bringing down most of a wooded clearing out of sheer, pent-up anger and frustration was proof enough that the boy was hurting deeply on the inside. Unable to stand watching anymore, Iruka came around from his hiding place and approached the boy. When Naruto heard the footsteps of somebody nearby, he looked up to see none other than his teacher step out of the shadows of the brush and stride over to him. At first, the blonde hurried to wipe the tears away from his eyes and stand up in a vain attempt to convey that there was nothing wrong with him, but the Chunin quickly swooped down and placed a hand on his shoulder before he could proceed any further. "Sensei? Wait a moment, Naruto." Reaching into the back of his pouch, the scarred shinobi pulled out some bandages from his kit. Unfurling them, he then started wrapping Naruto's hands up. Though he didn't break any bones, they were still worse for wear, so the man made sure to cover them up properly and firmly. The young Jinchuriki watched the teacher wrap up his hands cautiously for the better part of the 5 minutes that passed them by, but then looked away with a defiant expression on his face. "Thanks, you're welcome," Iruka smirked. Clasping both gauze wraps, he then propped himself back into his kneeling position and looked proudly at his work. "There, that should do it." Naruto flexed his fingers, finding them to be a bit numb from his workout. But that buzzing feeling went away moments later, leaving him with just the white gauze gloves covering up his self-inflicted injuries. The spiky-haired youngster then glanced at his teacher for a second time, a puzzled expression on his face. "Why are you here, sensei?" "Well, I was just out for a little afternoon stroll, thinking about what students I'm going to pass in tomorrow's graduation exam." He began his sincere reply with a thoughtful look on his face, before smiling and shrugging. "Then I heard a racket all the way out here, so I came to investigate." And Naruto furrowed his brow, knowing there was more to the story. "That's it," Iruka said assertively, nodding his head. Naruto frowned and stood up. Defiant as usual, he then turned back to what he was doing. Picking out a random tree that he hadn't destroyed, he walked over to it and began working against it with palm strikes and kicks. He went about it in a similar manner to how he had been before with his fists, only this time he was sure to keep this one upright for a longer period. Though his actions rallied further concern from Iruka, upon closer inspection of his fighting condition, the man saw that it wasn't bothering him. Using this moment of reprieve for a more detailed analysis, the Chunin concentrated on the area Naruto was using for practice and looked around. Now that he was in the middle of the clearing, Iruka saw that a great number of the trees had taken a beating. Not only had they been used as punching bags, but they also had crude targets drawn into the upper and lower levels of their trunks. Kunai and shuriken were lodged deeply into the sides of the wood surfaces, indicating strenuous, repeated practices. One tree in particular had clusters bunched up into it within the rings of the target, telling the shinobi that that particular tree had been the main object of the boy's attention. Judging from the extent of the damage that one tree had sustained, the Chunin concluded that Naruto must have used up a lot of his time getting to that particular stage of accuracy with his blades. Iruka blinked in surprise. "You were out here the entire day, Naruto?" Naruto huffed, finishing a palm strike and looking down at the grass at his feet. "Yeah, I take it you were working on your taijutsu then?" "Not just my taijutsu," Naruto replied, disheartened. A minute of pause later, he restarted his activity, slamming his palms into the sides of the tree several times, before angrily yelling out seconds later and throwing a roundhouse kick into the side of it, splitting the log where he hit. "But I also worked on the clone jutsu and the henge no jutsu." "And?" Iruka asked curiously, hoping for a positive answer but expecting something less. "And nothing." Naruto roared and slammed a sidekick into the tree's base, nearly splitting it in two. Hopping away, the blonde then grabbed his hair and pulled at it. He would have ripped his hair out from its roots if he hadn't tripped and fallen back against the new tree he was taking his frustration out on. Instead of attacking it even more, he simply let go of his frustration and collapsed against it, looking down at the ground with his eyes hidden by his hair and goggles. "I can't do it, sensei," Naruto sobbed. "I can't do any of the techniques you showed me. No matter how hard I try, no matter how much or how little chakra I use, no matter how hard I practice. I just can't get any of the techniques to work." Iruka saw how disappointed he was. Of course, with all of his hopes and dreams on the line, all of which were resting on tomorrow's exam, he had everything to lose. Becoming a ninja and becoming Hokage was everything Naruto had in his life. There was nothing else. Iruka could understand that. He had been in the same position Naruto was currently in when he was a student, playing the fool to hide a warrior's pain, causing mischief to gain recognition, and doing everything possible to be acknowledged by his peers for his talents, and to overlook his faults. But he was the teacher now and he was the one commanding the fates of the students at the academy. He was the one now dealing with the papers. Iruka decided at that moment that he was going to test his new theory inspired by the Hokage, and if it worked, it would help him settle the debate going on in his head. Looking around, the Chunin saw what Naruto had just accomplished on his own. He couldn't argue anymore about the boy's physical strength. After seeing him tear down several trees that even well-trained genin found hard to do was evidence enough. At this point, all he had to do was find out whether everything else wasn't just a fluke. Scratching his cheek, Iruka approached the boy lying against the tree. Pulling out a kunai from his pouch, the man then shadowed the youngster and held it out to him. When Naruto saw what it was being offered to him, he glanced up at Iruka questioningly, showing the tears brimming at his eyes. Iruka gave him a serious look. "Throw it, huh? I want you to throw this, Naruto," the man repeated, dropping the knife in his hand. He then stepped back, and stood about a meter in front, just enough for Naruto to see the trees about 500 yards behind him, the average throwing distance of a genin. The Chunin frowned as he glared down at him like a scolding father. "At the tree, behind me, sensei? You've been working hard, haven't you?" Iruka asked, earning a nod from the boy. "You've been sitting in my classes and my practical lessons. You've watched me and I've taught you. You've trained with your fellow students and you've trained on your own in your free time. Let's see what you can do." The tree, 12 degrees to my right, 40-degree elevation. The shuriken lodged in the upper branch on the left. "Dislodge it. Wah, but, do it?" Naruto, furrowing his brow and gritting his teeth, resigned to his fate. Taking aim, he then flipped the knife into a throwing grip and threw it. The knife sailed right over Iruka's right shoulder and ruffled his hair at how close it came, cutting through the wind with ease as it shot towards its mark. A second later, there was a loud clang when the kunai hit the tree branch, and knocked the shuriken in question from it. The ninja star fell from its placement and dropped to the ground, where it landed with a light thud. Naruto blinked in surprise, which earned a smirk from Iruka. The man then grabbed the boy by the shoulder and moved so that the Jinchuriki stood in front of him. The teacher took his place behind him and folded his arms, the blonde looking at the taller man over his shoulder. "You've still got a full pack?" "Why yeah. Alright." Iruka frowned. "Target A. Left. Third tree from the center, 10 degrees down." Naruto reacted immediately to the coordinates and reached into his pouch. Drawing a cluster of shuriken, he tossed them. The 4 stars cut through the air, and thudded one after the other against his poorly drawn circle at the base of the trunk, impaling the target. The blonde maintained his stance, glaring across the field. "Target B. Right. 4th tree from the center, 30 degrees up." The Jinchuriki did as instructed, reaching into his leg holster and drawing a kunai. With that quick draw, he tossed it with an upward throw, the knife slicing like a bullet through the space between the thrower and the target, before thumping hard against the tree. It hit its mark dead center, shaking a few leaves from the host. Target C and D. 4th left and 5th right from the center, 20 degree down and up. Naruto flicked his left and right hands, shuriken sliding from his jacket sleeves into his hands. In a flash, he tossed them in a cross throw, the stars curving through the air and passing each other a split second before hitting their assigned targets. Target E. Left. 3rd tree from the center, 10 degrees down. The blonde followed through with a shuriken. However, the star missed and hit the trunk instead. He gritted his teeth. "Damn it, don't stop. Repeat," Iruka shouted. Naruto did so with a second star, the weapon curving sharply and in a flash, struck the target squarely in the center. Target F and G. Right. 2nd from the center, 5 degrees down and 20 degrees up. The Jinchuriki drew 2 kunai from his pouch by the rings and threw them in an upwards throw as before. The blades broke through the air and split in a V motion, the blades thumping against their marks. Targets H, I and J. Left 2, left 4 and right 3, 20 degrees down, up and 30 degrees up. Multiple targets. Naruto reached back with both hands and drew clusters of shuriken between his fingers. With a yell and a swift cross throw while riding a low stance, just as he had practiced in class, he threw the metallic stars. The weapons broke through the air at random intervals, and one after the other hit their carefully assigned targets. When the thudding stopped and the tree ceased rattling, the blonde was standing in front of Iruka with his arms and hands extended, and panting heavily. Iruka furrowed his brow and looked down at his watch, pulling back the sleeve to check the time. He nodded his head and lowered his arm, before marching past Naruto and walking over to the first target he had aimed for. While Naruto remained planted where he was, just as all the students had been instructed to back during the practical sessions when on the range, the teacher went over to the tree at the far end and dropped to his knee on the grass. Quickly going through the thick brush, he then picked up the shuriken that the blonde had knocked from its position about several meters above him and looked at it. His finger ran over the chip that it had sustained when the kunai grazed it, and after collecting it, Iruka stood up and turned back around. Covering the return distance, he stopped in front of Naruto and held the shuriken out to him. The boy took it and looked at the iron star to see the chip, and his finger gently ran over it. In spite of his bandaged hands and bruised knuckles, which should have obstructed some of the flexibility in his digits, the gauze didn't hamper him at all. Once he had analyzed his prize, Naruto took a moment to look up at his teacher to see him smiling down at him. "You see, you can do it," Iruka exclaimed, before turning back to the firing range behind him and taking score. But, sensei, how? All targets neutralized with only one miss, and Iruka looked down at his watch again, all in less than 15 seconds, I make it. The man glanced at the boy with a smirk. All targets hit close to or dead center. You have been training, Naruto. But sensei, Naruto started, stepping forward. I still can't do the henge or clone jutsu. What does this have to do That, Iruka said, dropping to his knee in front of the boy and placing both his hands on his shoulders. Doesn't matter, Naruto. The point is, you've proven that you've been working hard throughout the entire year and that you've tried your best here. I can see that. His grip firmed and he smiled at the boy, who was still giving him a questioning look. When you're around others, you're just too focused on what everyone else is doing and what they're thinking about. Or you're just so focused on thinking about somebody else that you get distracted, and that you're too caught up in worrying about everything else that you can't concentrate on what you yourself are doing. But when you do focus on what you're doing, when you work hard on it, you do extremely well, you accomplish what you set out to do. That's what's important. He ruffled the blonde's hair, earning a blink from the boy, followed by a small smile and a nod. Iruka then grinned and stood up, looking back towards the targets. Besides, you just passed yesterday's test, and with an A+. Iruka exclaimed. Huh? Really? Naruto literally jumped, and looked up at the Chunin with renewed surprise and joy in his eyes. It was as if he had just been jump-started. The scarred man nodded. Yeah, Iruka stated affirmatively. You passed the preliminary tests leading up to the written exam and the Bunshin test. Let's see, recap. You've passed your taijutsu and stealth basics, though barely, and you're physically fit and fast enough to be a genin. The man then flashed a grin down at the boy, one that he was certain the youngster deserved. Not to mention I'm rewriting your shurikenjutsu test. Naruto grinned and stepped up to the man, looking as though he was about to start jumping around in excitement. Really, sensei? Yup. Iruka nudged him in the shoulder. Listen, if you can pass the written exam tomorrow, then I won't have to count the Bunshin test to your final score. I'll let you pass. Yata! Naruto exclaimed, leaping at the man and hugging him. Iruka chuckled when the boy latched onto him and ruffled his hair. However, after staggering about with his extra luggage for a moment, he managed to yank the blonde off of him and force the hopeful kid to look back up at him. Not only did he see tears of joy this time, Iruka also saw renewed determination and delight beaming from his face like the rays of a sun. But don't get your hopes up too high, Naruto, the man said, his expression becoming serious again. Not only do I need you to go home and study hard for tomorrow, but I also want you to later find out what is really wrong with your chakra network. The blonde shook off his tear-filled expression of joy and instead shot a look of surprise up at Iruka. You can use chakra like all of your other peers, but I don't think it's due to you slacking off or misplacing the steps. Just to be sure, I'll take you to see the doctor after the final exams to get you thoroughly checked. Okay. Naruto nodded firmly. Yes. He then pulled himself off of the man. Wiping his nose and eyes on his sleeve, he then hurriedly scampered out of the clearing, shuriken in hand. He waved back at his teacher as he left, disappearing into the trees. I'll study hard, Iruka-sensei. I promise. The man smiled and waved back. Once the boy had gone, he grinned and scratched his head in relief, looking back at the clearing. He whistled when he saw the state of the trees for the third time that night. Still, to do all of this with his bare hands. He looked down at his own knuckles for added emphasis, and rubbed them at the very thought of plowing them through solid wood. He winced at the idea of doing so. Even I would second think training like that. The man sighed and pocketed his hands, smiling at the scene. I guess Hokage-sama was right. Naruto really is something different. Iruka took his leave a few minutes later, not in the mood of cleaning up the field, and instead leaving it for Naruto to come back to. After all, this was his little training zone. What Iruka was unaware of when he departed from the scene, however, was that a pair of eyes had been watching him from the roof of the academy building the entire time. The elevation gave the onlooker a good view and ear to the entire area 2 to 3 stories below, and after watching what had transpired, the man with the white hair and donning the standard Konohagakure shinobi uniform cursed under his breath. That demon-loving son of a... The Chunin's hands tightened into fists. Well, if he's going to pass that brat tomorrow, I'll just have to find another way to get that scroll. Naruto sat in his seat in the classroom, upper body and head lying on the table with an exhausted and dreary look on his face. He had been like that since Iruka came around the aisles to pick up their exam sheets for marking, leaving him and the rest of the students with an hour or so of break time while their sensei ticked or crossed away. The atmosphere couldn't have been any more tense or any more chatty. Students left and right were either nervously watching their teacher's monotone expression as he flipped through the test sheets with his pen one after the other, or were turning in their chairs and having a conversation with the person next to or behind them. This left Naruto with nothing to do but to sit, wait and hope for the best. I spent all night studying all of my textbooks and scrolls, Naruto thought, groaning with a bit of drool leaking out of his mouth and his eyes squinted in their characteristic manner. I must have gone through 2 years worth of work and rework in 8 hours, Wanting to pass the time, Naruto looked up and around him to see if there was somebody nearby he knew that he could talk to, or try to talk to. Looking across the way to his right from where he was sitting, he saw Amy seated and chatting with one of her friends. Not really someone he knew very well, nor was she someone he really liked that much. She was kind of stuck up. Looking in front of him, he saw Choji. Kind of a weird guy, but he was more preoccupied with his chips than he was with what was going on around him. Sure, he had hung out with the guy a lot back when they were younger, which was fun, but after a short amount of time, the orange-haired boy sort of stopped hanging out with him. Which was even stranger considering the last time he saw him was when he was taken away by his dad when they were playing on the playground. Naruto then looked behind him, quickly dismissing his rotund classmate. He had a second to identify Sasuke sitting in the row above. He didn't want to talk to him at all. Full stop. Naruto then looked to his left. Shino was sitting next to him. Boy, was his luck high today. Though he barely knew the guy, the one thing that he did happen to know about the Aburame was that he was uncomfortably quiet. When he was placed in a lineup or crowd of students, he was normally the easiest to pick out because he was the tallest, was one of the only boys to wear sunglasses, and he just seemed to stare at you for hours on end. It was nerve-rattling. Nevertheless, figuring a one-sided conversation was still good conversation, Naruto sucked in air, his smugness, and let it all go, before smiling at the silent boy. "So, how did you do?" Shino turned towards him, his sunglasses flashing in the light from the sun beaming in through the windows. Naruto kept on smiling, even though the corner of his lip was twitching nervously under his classmate's intense gaze. He managed to keep his blue eyes locked with the other re-evaluation, with the other boy's sunglasses. Whether Shino was looking directly at him or not was a good question, since those things obscuring his eyes made it difficult to determine otherwise. Regardless, it was still unnerving. The blonde Jinchuriki's smile faltered a little after a full minute of silence, and after another 30 seconds and not getting even a visual quirk from the shady academy student, Naruto looked away. He plopped his chin back down on the desk in front of him with a submitted expression adorning his features, and simply took up to staring at the blackboard at the front of the classroom, hoping to see the words written on it come to life and start attacking each other for his amusement. "Yeah, I think I did okay as well," Naruto sighed. What was the point? Even Shino refused to talk to him. But understandably, responding to an unasked question seemed the most logical answer. "It was a fair test," Shino replied, his voice set on a single track and tone. Naruto literally jumped in his seat when he heard the statue speak, and looked over at the Aburame with a bewildered look on his face. He was more or less surprised. Then again, who was he to argue? He wasn't even expecting Shino to reply. "Oh, so you can talk?" Naruto exclaimed, resting his hands on the table. "I was waiting to see if you were going to add any more detail to your question," Shino murmured back, his glasses flashing. "However, repeating my answer from before, I believe the test we had just taken was fair. I'm anticipating good marks at the end of today." Naruto blinked. Man, and he thought Sasuke was wound up. Shino, on his end, was just as quiet as the Uchiha, but went about it in his own way. Then, when he actually provided some dissent input into anything, he only said what he needed to say and nothing else. They were very short, untimely responses, mostly due to the long pauses. This was something he picked up in class whenever Shino answered a question, and it sort of put Naruto off a bit. It was enough to make him feel like not wanting to continue a prolonged conversation with the guy. Actually, with the way he responded, Naruto was wondering whether Shino was much for talking in the first place. It wasn't a really social response. He was pretty damn passive for a normal person. The Jinchuriki just smiled weakly and looked away. "That's cool, Shino," Naruto chuckled. "I just wanted to know how well you did in your test, that's all." "And, how did you do, Naruto Uzumaki?" Shino asked in kind, his expression and tone unchanged. The Jinchuriki glanced over at him, raising his head somewhat. Fairly well. I studied all night." "I see," Shino nodded back. Satisfied with that answer, the boy looked back towards the front, continuing his wait for the final stage of the exams. Best of luck to you. You too, Naruto replied, and rested his chin back on the table. For the next minute or so, the Jinchuriki threw odd glances over at his glasses-wearing classmate, unable to shake the chill that ran down his spine every time he did so. Man, that guy creeps me out sometimes. It took Iruka some time, but he eventually filed through all of the tests he had collected from his students. After checking to make sure he had ticked off all of the names present, he put the sheets into a separate folder and collected all the other non-essential documents on his workspace into his arms. He then rose to his feet, his movements silencing everyone in the room and drawing the class's attention towards him. Okay, now that your written tests are over and done with, we can move on to the final phase of the examination process, Iruka announced, arm behind his back as he looked down at his clipboard and the list of student names provided. In order to obtain a solid pass, you'll have to do a Bunshin no Jutsu and produce 2 clones. When you're called up, come into the next room. Jutsu. Naruto thought with a look of dread on his face, during which time Iruka exited the classroom with the first student on his list in tow. Even after all that time practicing, I still can't do a single one. Why? He dropped his right hand in front of him where he laid with his chin on the cold surface of the table, and glared at his palm. Flexing his fingers a few times, he then scrunched it up into a tight fist. Is it because of these things attached to my wrists? Am I not doing it right or what? Come on. From that point onwards, Naruto spent whatever free time he had in between the present and his clone jutsu test, trying to perform a descent bunshin in class, while one after the other, students were called into the room next door to take their final test. But despite his efforts, the young blonde just could muster any chakra during the transformation process. He even tried hopping on top of his desk and trying a stand-up approach, but it was no use. While he was squatting with his hands formed into the correct seal and his face looking like he was going to drop a hard one, several of the students around him couldn't help but notice his plight. What in the world are you doing? Shikamaru asked, walking down the stairs towards the door, hands in his pockets and looking like he didn't care, looking like he didn't care about anything going on really. Although, he was a bit concerned over the blonde's public display. Naruto glared down at his classmate from where he stood on the desk. Why? Is it bothering you? Look, it's not that hard. The toilet is down the hall, 6th door on the left with the little man on the front. You can't miss it, Shikamaru thumbed over his shoulder. He was willing to guess what his eccentric friend was doing, but he had half a mind thinking that it probably wasn't what his other half was imagining. A tick mark formed on the Jinchuriki's head, followed by gritted teeth which he directed down at the lazy, good-for-nothing. I'm not trying to take a dump. I'm trying to perform a jutsu. Yeah, well? Shikamaru picked at his ear and flicked the excess wax away after digging it out. Either way, it's not that hard. Good luck with whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. What a drag, the boy muttered before continuing on his way out of the room. Naruto shook his head and proceeded from then on, while several of the other potential genins sitting around him snickered. Eventually, Naruto was called into the next room to undergo his final phase of the exam. Dropping down from the desk, the blonde marched out of the class and into the next one, where he was placed in the middle of an empty hall with his 2 senseis Iruka and Mizuki sitting at a desk in front of him. The 2 chunin watched and waited patiently, as the Jinchuriki took a stance and formed a hand seal. I've got to try. Naruto shut his eyes tightly and gathered his chakra. Please, just one, please. But the results were the same as before. Try as he might, he could gather his chakra, but couldn't do anything with it. It just sat stone cold in his stomach. Eventually, after several minutes, both chunin grew impatient. They only continued to watch him to the point where sweat began spilling from his face and he turned blue. By which time, they both decided to call it a day on the boy wonder. Iruka shook his head and simply ticked off Naruto's name, whereas Mizuki was laughing on the inside as he sat back with his arms folded, watching the blonde struggle. That's okay, Naruto. Iruka smiled up at the boy, who then keeled over onto his back, landing with a loud thud on the floor. Clearly, even with his persistence, he had given up. You pass, barely. Come on. The scarred shinobi picked up one of the headbands on the table and held it up, emphasizing that his student had at least made it through academy, at last. The youngster quickly recovered from his collapse, and after the dizziness faded, Naruto wasted no time in picking himself up and jogging on over to collect his long-awaited prize. "Are you sure you want to pass him, Iruka?" Mizuki asked with concern, glancing over at his companion as he handed the headgear over to the eager teen. "I mean, he hasn't been able to perform any jutsu successfully throughout his years at the academy. He's failed 2 times, and it was always at this point." "Nobody is perfect, Mizuki," Iruka replied as he commented in the space under Naruto's name for the record. In the meantime, the blonde in question was leaping around the room in front of them happily, hugging the headband to him as if it were a treasured possession returned to him. "I trust him to work hard, and that's all I need to have faith in him. But, besides," Iruka smirked over at the other teacher, "I was distinctly reminded by the Hokage that there were a couple of past students who did pass, and that they had no talent for jutsu whatsoever." The Chunin nodded his head affirmatively and then turned towards the subject under discussion, while Mizuki remained quiet where he sat, unable to deter his comrade from his decision. "Alright Naruto, you can go. Yata!" the blonde exclaimed, wrapping the headband around his head and giving his teacher the thumbs up. "Thank you, Iruka-sensei," the boy shouted and, without a moment to waste, ran out of the room. The scarred Chunin who had been thanked shook his head with a small smile and rose to his feet, intent on retrieving the next student. This left Mizuki sitting in his chair, glaring out the door Naruto had recently dashed through. HMPH, it can't be helped. Guess I'm going to have to do this chore myself. Later that afternoon, Iruka sat outside in the hallway of the hospital he had taken Naruto to. If there was any place a shinobi was going to get their body checked for any faults or, in regards to shinobi as well, their chakra network, then it was here. The Chunin had decided to drop him on a specialist this time in one of the departments, a Hyuga who was well rehearsed in treating the chakra network throughout the body. If there was a problem with Naruto, then that person was the one to visit. After about an hour of waiting, Iruka got the wake-up call he needed from his bench. As soon as the door to the office opened, the Chunin was on his feet and facing the doctor who had finished her checkup on Naruto. The woman with long brown hair and wearing a light and dark blue, flower-patterned kimono was going over the documents on her clipboard when she looked up to see Iruka standing right in front of her. The crystal-eyed Hyuga acknowledged his presence with a nod. "Well?" Iruka asked with shrug. "How is he?" "In terms of physical and mental health, a perfect male specimen," the woman replied, flipping a page on her clipboard over and skim-reading her notes. "He's extremely fit for a boy his age, clean and well-rested. However, I advise you may want to consider adding more vegetables to his diet. He told me in detail what he had for lunch today and I'm a bit surprised that broth hasn't been found in his bloodstream yet." Iruka furrowed his brow. "I'll take that as a side note, ma'am. What I mean is, how is his chakra network?" The Hyuga woman then developed a very puzzled expression as she flipped another page, and scrolled down it to the issues at hand, if there were any. She considered the information she had documented on her checkup to be quite perplexing and after a minute or so, looked back up at the Chunin curiously. "So you're saying he can't perform any jutsu?" "Yes." Iruka folded his arms and gave her a firm nod to affirm. "I've been teaching him for years and have even brought him in for several face-to-face catch-up lessons in his spare time. He's got the basic steps and processes down, and he's also physically worked over the steps himself." "But," the Chunin shrugged, "it's been 2 years and, well, nothing." "I see. Well, that's certainly interesting," the woman replied, looking back down at her charts and sliding her pen off of its catch. Clicking it, she began scribbling the information she was given down. "I'm surprised that the other doctors didn't find anything wrong with him." "Why do you say that?" Iruka asked, concern now lacing in with his serious tone of voice. "According to these scans, his chakra network throughout most of his body is fine," the Hyuga explained, moving closer to the Chunin and showing him the scans of Naruto's spiritual and physical energy system. She began pointing out the key areas of the boy's body, around the stomach, head and limbs. She even emphasized the various points along the branches of the chakra passages, having made sure to account for everything. Note: there are no blockages around the left side of his body, heart or stomach. His chakra flow is smooth and unbroken, so there shouldn't be any issues with him learning the advanced exercises as a genin, such as the tree climbing and water walking exercises. "So, what's the problem?" Iruka asked. After I scanned him, I found some irregularities that I have never seen in a patient before, the Hyuga informed and turned to another scan, pointing out Naruto's right arm and circling it with her red pen to draw the Chunin's attention to the problem. He has a huge well of chakra, more chakra than I have ever seen in a human being, and I'm not talking about his clears throat, resident. All of that chakra is his. Chunin, Jonin, not even the Hokage's levels come even close to the amount of energy that he has. But that's not the problem. The problem is here, his arm leading from the shoulder down. The chakra passages aren't blocked and the key points aren't obstructing any flow. The network there is completely open, so his chakra should be fluid through there all the way through to his hand and fingers. But for some reason, it's not. There is no chakra going through there whatsoever. It's like it's being nullified or pushed back. Is that bad? For a ninja who relies solely on jutsu, yes. But this boy doesn't, so it's okay, the doctor stated and then moved the board back into her view to analyze it a bit more closely. This is something that can easily be overlooked, and it has. You can look at him time and again on the outside and test him physically, and you'll find nothing wrong. However, deep underneath the skin it's a completely different story. I had to use my Byakugan to examine the full extent of the problem. Really? Iruka asked incredulously. Believe me, even I found it difficult trying to spot the abnormality. The woman looked back up at the man with a firm gaze. I don't know why. Usually I can see the chakra network as clear as day, but around that boy my Byakugan suddenly went hazy. I got a headache just from looking him over. Iruka murmured, looking away. That's unusual. Naruto isn't that hard to figure out. This ability issue seems to extend far beyond his chakra network. It's even affecting others around him. This explains why young Naruto can't perform any jutsu, she continued, tapping the board. A normal shinobi would have a steady chakra flow throughout their entire body. The balance of yin and yang is maintained via the limbs and molded through hand seals from the center of the chakra network, where chakra manifests itself. It's what allows a shinobi, even a novice, to perform the most basic of techniques. I'm surprised Naruto could actually feel his chakra to begin with. To be able to manifest it in the conventional way, in his case, would be impossible. That arm is causing him way too many problems, so he can't perform jutsu using normal hand seals. It cancels out his chakra and stops its flow completely. She then showed him the chart under the one she was on, showing a blue branch area around the body which Iruka assumed was Naruto's normal chakra network. Then he was drawn to the arm in question, where instead of seeing blue chakra, he saw a purple tree effect branching from the shoulder down. What is that? Iruka asked. I have no clue, the Hyuga shook her head. Whatever it is, it's beyond me. His chakra network isn't damaged, he has plenty of energy to share with an entire army, and there are no physical or mental abnormalities causing this effect. I'm pretty much at a loss. But whatever this is, she closed up her clipboard and tucked it under her arm. It's a unique case. Young Naruto will need to find out a new way to perform jutsu without hand seals if that right arm of his is going to keep getting in the way. There is nothing I can do about it. Iruka nodded in understanding. Thank you very much. I'll take care of it. He then gestured towards her office. Is he okay? The woman nodded with a wave of her hand. Yes, he's fine. You can take him home now. He took the information better than I expected. What with the rabble he's caused to us in the past after each of his visits. She shook her head in dismay as she departed, both amused and distraught at the memories she has had in this hospital involving her compatriots having to deal with the troublesome youngster. My goodness. Iruka smiled a bit when the doctor left, but then quickly turned his attention to the room. Just as he was about to open the door, it opened for him and Naruto came stepping out, zipping up his jacket with his headband hanging around his neck. Looking about, the blonde then looked up into his sensei's concerned face, which he returned with a smile. Hey Iruka-sensei. Naruto grinned. That doctor lady was very nice. Yes, Naruto, she was. Iruka cleared his throat and adjusted his collar. Anyway, are you feeling okay? I mean, I'm sure the doctor already told you what is wrong with why. It's okay, sensei, the Jinchuriki replied quickly, closing the door behind him and showing the man his right hand. He flexed it several times, as if it were an interesting show and tell item. It's this, isn't it? I can't control my chakra properly because of my right hand and arm, right? Re-GHT, the Chunin replied with an affirmative nod, now slowly starting to feel a little bit anxious of what Naruto was really thinking about his current situation. Not really being the brightest kid, he was still the most spontaneous student he had ever known, so Iruka had a right to feel concerned, for a lot of reasons. Please don't come up with any stupid ideas, Naruto, please. So, if I want to be able to use jutsu just like everybody else in my class, I have to chop off my arm and sew a new one on, right? Naruto asked excitedly. Really, he sounded all too enthusiastic over the idea. He thought it was brilliant. Iruka, on the other hand, had it placed flat against his face. Okay, please don't come up with anything stupid or crazy. Iruka rubbed the bridge of his nose and shook his head in dismay. He then immediately placed his hand on the boy's shoulder to calm him down. Naruto, you can't just chop off your own arm and put a new one on just because you can't use any jutsu. It still won't solve your problem of how you're going to be able to use ninja techniques with your hands. It's something you'll be, and I am disappointed at you for just thinking about. This statement had Naruto's excitement, as well as his eagerness to go through with his plan, plummet. After coming so close to an easy solution to his dilemma, his teacher immediately went and forbade it, or made it seem to the boy that he had forbidden it. But Iruka was impressionable that way. But, sensei? Look, it's not the end of the world, and it certainly isn't something you can go and start mutilating your body over. It's not right. Iruka lowered himself down to one knee and began explaining the situation to his student on a more eye-to-eye level. He braced the boy by both his shoulders and lightly shook him, just to make sure he was paying attention. Listen, even though you can't use jutsu with the hand seals you've learned in class, you can still be a ninja. There are ninja in our village who can't use jutsu or don't use any because they choose not to. Naruto blinked in surprise, and dropped his hands to his sides at this new reality. Are really? Iruka smiled and nodded. It's true. Maybe, if you're lucky, someday you might run into one or two of them around Konoha. You'll never know, the teacher informed, with Naruto smiling at the prospect of being able to meet famous and awesome shinobi who didn't use ninjutsu techniques at all. This is a big village, and it is an even bigger world out there. People just have to cope with what they have and adapt to whatever the world throws at them, just like how you'll have to learn to live with your troublesome right arm. You can still use chakra, but you'll have to master it in a different way, and I think I can help you along with that. With that said, the man then rose to his feet. Letting out a sigh of relief, he then decided to focus more on the new concept he had in mind that he knew would help the young Jinchuriki out. After all, he wouldn't be able to call himself a teacher if he didn't guide his students in the right direction every once in a while. There are easier ways to solving your problem other than senselessly chopping your arms off. Oh? Naruto blinked and placed his hand on his chin in thought. After a brief moment of contemplation, he looked back up at his teacher. Like, working hard to be an awesome ninja without jutsu? Lucky guess, Iruka chuckled and began leading the boy on down the hallway. There are things that you can learn that I wasn't able to teach you in class. Stuff that you're expected to learn by yourself. You especially need to teach yourself how to use completely different techniques that you can employ without your chakra. Like what, sensei? Naruto asked curiously, looking up at his teacher after fastening his headband back onto his forehead. Well, I'll show you, sometime later. Konoha Library. Why do we have to be here, sensei? Naruto whined out in a strained voice, while carrying a stack of at least a dozen books in his arms, at the same time waddling after his teacher whom was patrolling the surrounding shelves, accompanied by a young lady who had volunteered to help them out. I hate the library, and I hate books. Naruto's practical shout had nearby patrons shush at him. The blonde quickly clamped his mouth shut as dictated by the other visitors and simply resigned himself to following his sensei. To him, this was torture. But to Iruka, it was more like a pleasure walk. The man hummed to himself as he skimmed over the backs of the books left and right. The shelves literally ran up to the roof, which had to be 10 feet above them. For all those articles that they couldn't reach on their own, the young lady, who had to be at least a couple of years older than Naruto, ran up and down the sliding ladder to collect those books. She had light blonde, slightly unkempt hair hung back in a ponytail, wore glasses with a swirl pattern in them, and a white coat over a red dress, casual gear, and her ninja headband worn around her waist. Despite her age, she was quite intimate with the library, and knew exactly what Naruto needed as she scaled the shelves up and down at a comfortably hurried pace. She also sung herself a happy tune to fill in the white noise around them while she scanned the upper levels of the shelves, plucking another desirable book from the top. Let's see. Outdoor Survival Volume 1, you'll definitely need this. Oh, and Volume 2. The girl named Shiho exclaimed, and slid down the ladder back to the floor. As soon as she hit carpet, she placed the 2 books on Naruto's already significant pile. So far, the stack the Jinchuriki was struggling to carry consisted of stealth and taijutsu basics and advancements, an assortment of materials that would teach him how to cope in the wild when supplies were low or not, weapons maintenance, ninjutsu and genjutsu albums and how to identify them, and 3 copies of physical exercises and fighting forms to go with his taijutsu. It was a pretty hefty load, which Naruto could feel in his lower back and shoulders. "Iruka-sensei," Naruto hissed, feeling a copy of basic hand seals weigh him down even more. "Is this enough?" His body was trembling under the pressure at this point. "Geez, Naruto. You can split logs 2 meters thick, yet a few light reading articles are weighing you down?" Iruka asked with a grin. "Perhaps I've overestimated your strength?" "No, not at all." Naruto panted, gritting his teeth as he propped the stack up even more to balance his core. "It's just a cramp in my thigh. Nothing big." The blonde quickly shook it off, hoping this little excursion wouldn't cost him his headband on his first day. Iruka had to suppress a little laugh at his complaints. Shiho hummed as she ran the ladder down the aisle and stopped midway. Clambering up some, she then plucked what looked like a really heavy book on sealing techniques. On her way down, she then spotted an old-looking book she knew quite well, which was just sitting there. Shrugging her shoulders, she plucked that as well and clambered down the rest of the way. Landing in front of her fellow ninjas, she then systematically placed the 2 items on top of the overloaded walking cart. "You'll need this, quadruple A&D. She jogged over to the other side of the aisle, grabbed a copy of Explosive Tags. How Not to Get Your Legs Blown Off, and skipped back over. That one book had Naruto drop down some more. The boy broke out into a sweat as he attempted to maintain his balance, while Shiho dusted her hands down with a grin. "There, that should do it. Thank Kami," Naruto wheezed. Iruka grinned and patted him on the back. "Oh yes, this truly is a godsend," the Chunin replied before smiling over at the girl who had assisted them. "Thanks very much, Shiho. I really appreciate this." "Not to worry," the girl exclaimed, adjusting her glasses as she strolled over to another section of the aisle they were in, and pulling another book out from between its cousins. "I was a genin once, so I know exactly what he needs." She studied the title. Explosive Tags, How to Master Their Fire. She then walked over to Naruto and placed that one on top of the other. "Oh, come on, shush." Several of the other library attendants hushed, glaring at the loud boy responsible for yet another outburst. Naruto grinned nervously and in embarrassment, and waved back at them. "Sorry, well now, let's get you acquainted to all these books I picked out for you." Shiho giggled, and hurried both the ninja back down the rows of shelves towards the seating area. Come. Time is essential for a shinobi's learning, which is something we have little of, I'm afraid." She took the pair to one of the vacant cubicles along one of the library's walls and planted the boy and his reading material there. Once he had placed the books down and got the wind back into him, Naruto then took the very first book he was given, which was a volume on basic ninja tactics and stealth, and pulled up a chair. It was a heavy read in its own right, which made him quite discouraged at the idea of reading it. But Iruka, regardless of his student's reluctance or his expression of doubt, opened the book up to the first chapter and slapped his finger down on the very first word. "Get to it, Naruto," Iruka exclaimed and ruffled his hair. "This book isn't going to read itself." "But Iruka-sensei." Naruto spun around in his seat and looked pleadingly up at his teacher. "I can't read all these books at once. It'll kill me." "Well then, be smart about it. I'm not asking you to read all of them today or in one night. Pace yourself, work at it, and read a bit every day between your lunch breaks and training, until you've finished, and then read some more. Rinse and repeat," Iruka stated, and tapped the side of his head. "Just remember, the sharpest tool in a shinobi's arsenal isn't his techniques, his swords or his kunai, it is his brain." "His brain?" Naruto blinked out of his distressed appearance from his teacher's statement. "Are you sure?" The boy tried running a finger down the side of his head to test his theory, but then when he looked down at his fingertip, he saw no blood. It doesn't seem that sharp to me. Iruka shook his head in dismay at what he saw his student try to accomplish from his actions, while Shiho giggled on the sidelines, trying not to lose it. He didn't know whether it was a joke or not, but he knew the boy wasn't one to miss a beat with these things. Regardless of its hilarity, the academy teacher knew he had to make this work for the boy, or risk losing him the moment he stepped out on his first mission. The scarred Chunin took Naruto by the shoulders and shook him out of his daze, drawing the youngster's attention back up to him. This is no joke, Naruto. This is important. Listen to me. A carpenter may have all the right tools and equipment he needs, but without the knowledge or the proper instructions on how to follow through with his craftsmanship, he can't build the floor or fix the house he is working on. This is the same principle that applies to us shinobi. If you're on a mission, and you approach an objective without a well-constructed plan, you will be killed. Naruto visibly flinched at that and how Iruka emphasized the word, killed, in his sentence. Without the knowledge or the correct methods on how to use your techniques or your tools, and you run into a fight without thinking first, you will also be killed. You can endanger yourself and your comrades if you don't know what you're doing or how you're going to accomplish your objective. Naruto gulped at the seriousness in his teacher's voice and the information he was being given, and looked back at the pile of books in front of him. Out of all the material in Konohagakure, these books are our most important resource. They detail our village's history, our lives, and are the foundations to everything we have ever built or are going to build, Iruka informed, folding his arms. If it weren't for these books, all our past shinobi would have been nothing more than pig farmers and beggars. Use these books to carry on our village's legacy, learn new and awesome techniques, learn of our history, our tactics, and come up with your own techniques and tactics once you've mastered the ones you can. These books will guarantee your success in the future. At this point, the large stacks of assorted reading material were starting to look more appetizing to the new genin. Iruka grinned behind the boy's back. The Chunin knew full well of Naruto's reluctance of reading stuff he didn't know about, as well as his dislike of reading vast amounts given to him. This was accentuated in the amount of homework he gave out and got back, with Naruto either doing the absolute minimum or forgetting it completely. Only when his situation seemed desperate would he cram, and cram he did. It was how he was able to pass his final written test with an 80, which was an incredible jump from the 40s and 60s he was getting beforehand. What Naruto needed was literary practice, and by Kami, Iruka was going to make him work on it. If there was any time he was going to make up for Naruto's lost ground over the years, this was it. He was the only one who could get him to, if no one else. Seeing Naruto on the brink, Iruka pushed one last time, slamming his hand down on the open book in front of the boy, hard, literally shaking the entire cubicle. I figured it would piss you off, Naruto. Iruka shouted unexpectedly right into the boy's ear. To have your classmates mock you for so long. Kiba, Ino, Amy, Sasuke, what are you going to do about them? Huh? Naruto's eyes widened at his teacher's words. The reminder of those names struck a chord deep within him, and out of the blue, the voices of his classmates and their laughter from yesteryear began filling his ears. Huh, what a dumbass. Failed again? Kiba chuckled. You're nothing but a loser, a dead last, the underdog. How do you become Hokage if you can't even understand the simplest of things, you idiot? Ino frowned. All you'll do is get yourself killed. The idea of her folding her arms and scolding him filled his head with frustration, which caused him to clench his fists angrily. You're a moron. That's all you'll be, it's all you'll ever be, Amy stated with a prideful grin. Morons don't become Hokage, especially a failure like you. Hey, loser, Sasuke chuckled, his smirk being the biggest one of them all. More and more faces filled Naruto's head, his ears becoming clouded with laughter and past mockery. His fists clenched even tighter and his teeth gritted. With a loud growl, Naruto slammed his fist on the table together and turned to glare up at Iruka, pointing at him. Alright, damn it, you're on, sensei. Naruto roared and quickly turned back to his book, his eyes falling onto the chapter in front of him as if it were an opponent glaring him down. With his new mindset established, he began reading what was laid out before him. I will read every single book you throw at me and become an awesome Hokage. The best Hokage. Just you watch. Iruka grinned and patted him on the back. That's the spirit. Excuse me, sir. Just like that, the mood just melted away. An old woman's voice filled the air, causing Iruka to freeze instantaneously and stand stock straight on the spot directly outside of their cubicle. Slowly turning around, the scarred Chunin came face to face with the librarian. The woman wearing arced glasses and the red kimono looked to be around her 80s, an appeal that was often mistaken for a harmless and kind-hearted individual. However, despite her appearance, she had the reflexes of a cat and the strength of an ox. With a swift swipe and a vice-like grip, she grabbed Iruka by the ear and pulled him down to her level. Since she stood a couple of feet beneath his nose, it was pretty amusing to see Iruka get manhandled like he was. The Chunin was forcefully bent over rather painfully with a red, throbbing ear. Ow, ow, ow. We do not tolerate loud shinobi in this library, the librarian informed coldly, before turning heel and marching towards the exit with her troublesome quarry in tow. The man cried out at the fingernails piercing his earlobe as he was dragged across the room. I suggest you take your big mouth and your misguided enthusiasm outside, young man. Take it out on the training fields, not the books. But, ow. Iruka whined and winced as he was tugged around the corner. Before he was completely out of sight, however, he turned back to Naruto. With his last ounce of strength, he called out with an extended hand. Shiho, teach him in my stead. I'm counting on you. www. The girl watched the man disappear, and after hearing the sound of the doors revolving on their hinges as he was ungraciously kicked out, turned back to Naruto. When she did, she saw that his attention was still fixed on the book and not on the commotion. It was an interesting spectacle. Shadowing him for a minute or so, the young girl watched him study. He seemed to be stressed out at first, and appeared to be rereading the same text over and over again, apparently having found something important. At this sight, Shiho then got an idea and ran around to the library desk where she normally worked. After rummaging through the materials in the cabinets for a moment, she then jogged back and placed a pen and a blank, hardcover textbook beside the boy. Naruto looked down at it in surprise, before glancing up at the blonde-haired girl as she planted herself in the chair beside him. She smiled and gestured towards the new goods she had provided for him. Here, you can use these to help you in your study. Write down everything that you find useful. Naruto took the blank book and considered it. Momentarily looking it over from cover to cover, he then smirked and opened it to the first page. Taking up the pen, he put his dominant hand to work and at the same time flipped through the chapters set before him. For the next few hours he would remain in the library, with Shiho sitting right beside him to oversee his progress, and assist him when needed. Later that night, Hiruzen Sarutobi was feeling a lot more cheerful this afternoon. Although the ruckus the other day with the Hokage monument did cause somewhat of a small headache for him, it was nothing big. Because today, it was all quiet. No shinobi rushing into his office with an emergency, no messages of impending doom, no threats of invasion made from other surrounding nations, and no news whatsoever of a little boy with blonde hair and wearing orange causing any havoc around his village. So far today, Konohagakure was absolutely silent. Not a whisper on the wind or any signs of disturbance. That was the way he liked it. His hat off for the day and with time to spare, the third Hokage decided to go to his living room for a nice hot cup of tea and a nap. After all, it has been a while since he had had an afternoon all to himself. It was ample time for him to contemplate on past memories and give further thought to the future, with all considerations towards a better one. He needed to keep his mind clear. While making his way down the hallway, the small smile he was wearing as he puffed on his pipe suddenly vanished. Pausing for but a moment, the elder perked an eyebrow and veered to the right, stepping off of his intended path. It seems, things weren't as quiet as he was hoping for. Traversing down a different corridor, he came to a stop just outside of his reading room across from the scroll storage room. This part of the mansion had been built back in the time of Hashirama Senju and was designed to store all the closely guarded secrets of the cages. The entrances had been premeditated to alert the current resident of the mansion of any intruders, which was why the third was here to investigate. Access was only permitted to authorized personnel and the present, reigning Hokage. Somebody was boldly overstepping their boundaries. Huffing on his pipe, the third entered the reading room soundlessly and with no hint of worry whatsoever. Treading carefully in the dark for several paces, the old man then effortlessly reached out and with a flick of the switch, turned the lights on. The overhead illuminators blinked into life and lit up the entire room in a bright orange glow. A hardwood floor with white walls and railings up in the ceiling, and shelves of assorted books and scrolls lined up along the lengths of walls were the primary fixtures of the hall. There was also a reading desk set up against the far side of the room with a comfy chair seated alongside it, making up the definitive aspects of the chamber. There was no place like a private study area. Hiruzen walked up to his desk and looked down at the empty seat momentarily. He then sighed and looked up, his expression conveying his lack of amusement to the situation. "What are you doing in my house, Naruto?" the third asked to the wall in front of him, but meant it for the set of ears hiding up in the rafters. A split second later, a body fell from the shadows of the railings above and landed with a loud thud against the hard floor. The third turned around and glanced down at the blonde staggering back to his feet, a bundle of scrolls in his arms and a large one hanging from his back. The elder raised an eyebrow while he watched the boy gather up the articles he had dropped before grinning at the village leader. "Hey, Sarutobi Gigi," Naruto grinned. "Naruto," Hiruzen grumbled with his voice set on a low tone and close to dangerous. "Have you resorted to stealing from me? Huh, oh, no, of course not. Why would I steal from you, Oji-san?" Naruto hurriedly replied, trying not to drop the scrolls as he hopped over to the reading desk and deposited them on top of it. Leaving the big one to hang at his side from the strap over his shoulder, he then staggered back a bit and stood before the Hokage with his hands behind his back and a shame-filled look on his face. "I am sorry, Gigi. It won't happen again," the Hokage sighed as he shook his head down at the boy. "That's quite alright, lad." He removed the pipe from his lips and then gestured down at the other item hanging at his side. "Why do you have the first Hokage's scroll of seals with you?" "Oh?" Naruto jumped a bit, before fumbling around to move the giant article into view. He removed the strap from his neck and propped the scroll upright in front of him, with a wide, beaming grin on his face. "You mean this?" "Yes, that," the elder replied, lowering his pipe and giving the boy a sterner gaze. "Did you take that from the vault?" Naruto nodded his head excitedly, earning another mumble from the Hokage as he tapped the tip of his pipe against his balding head. "Naruto, that is a very dangerous relic you are holding," Hiruzen murmured, looking down upon the object as if it were a cursed item. The first Hokage sealed away many forbidden techniques within that object and locked it away in this mansion, so that no other ninja could learn of its secrets. "There are kinjutsu of the worst kind on that scroll you are holding, harmful abilities that are not to be performed even by the most formidable of shinobi, particularly a young upstart such as you." Naruto's face fell at this news, and watched as the Hokage stepped forward and tapped against the side of it. "Why on earth would you come to my place seeking such a thing?" Blinking, Naruto then smiled again and rushed to the desk. He laid the giant scroll down on it and unfurled it a bit, before turning back to the village leader. "So I can learn ninjutsu, Gigi." "So you can learn ninjutsu?" Naruto nodded his head feverishly. Yup. I read in one of the books that Shiho-chan gave me that the Hokage mansion had mountains of scrolls in the storage rooms, containing all sorts of techniques throughout our village's history. I figured, because I can't use normal hand seals like everybody else, maybe I could find a technique in one of these scrolls that even I could use, because I can't use normal ninjutsu. The blonde frowned a bit at this and looked down at his hands. Glancing from palm to palm, he clenched both his fists tightly and looked back up at the third with determination evident on his face. "Iruka-sensei said that I could learn new techniques by reading. So I came here to learn from the cage scrolls, because the Hokage can do everything. Right?" Hiruzen considered the boy's words for a while, his face scrunching up a bit after listening to the youngster's exclamations. He then smiled slightly after his mind worked around the information in his head, and he shrugged his shoulders as he watched Naruto jump back into a stance and set his fingers in a cross-like seal. It was one of the first techniques he had learned from the Scroll of Seals, and he was determined to make at least one of the jutsu work. "See, if I can use hand seals that aren't like the ones taught at the academy, then maybe I can finally perform ninja techniques," Naruto exclaimed with a grin. The third stepped away with his attention fixated on the youngster, pipe hanging from his mouth and hands behind his back. Curious to see what the boy had learned from his brief period here, Hiruzen observed as the Jinchuriki concentrated hard and began the simple process of molding chakra. "Well, attempted to." The Hokage unflinching watched Naruto struggle, puffing on his pipe lightly as the boy tried to produce a jutsu. However, after several unyielding attempts, the Jinchuriki eventually threw in the towel and grabbed his right wrist with his left, and throttled it. He was glowing red with frustration by the time the minute of practical experimentation was over. "Stupid arm," the boy roared, shaking his limb. "You good for nothing. Calm down, lad," Hiruzen chuckled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder and ceasing his attack on himself. The spiky-haired rookie, crestfallen at yet another failed attempt, glanced up at the village leader when he felt the elder jerk him lightly to get his attention. "Look, I'm sure you've taken Iruka's words to heart, that you can read to learn and surpass all your weaknesses, but you should really know that there are some things that you just can't learn." The old man then gestured down at the giant article unrolled on the table. "This scroll that you took from my storage room is one of those things that you're not allowed to learn from, with the contents of it better off not learning at all." "But Oji-san," Naruto took the elder's hand on his shoulder and squeezed. What am I going to do about ninjutsu then? I want to learn it, but I can't do it. The doctor says I can't and Iruka-sensei, he. Well, the third sighed and rubbed the back of his head thoughtfully, his pipe still hanging from his mouth. After a moment of thinking of a way of cheering up the boy and setting him straight, the elder then smiled and refocused attention on the young genin. "Listen Naruto, I've lived a long life, and have seen and learned many things. One of these things that I've learned is that life isn't easy. But with every obstacle and with every pothole I've encountered over the years, I've corrected myself. I worked my way around those obstacles and hopped over every pothole, and have kept my eyes open for any more with every step that I've taken, yet I still managed to hit some sort of roadblock. I've learned from every accomplishment and every failure I've had. Do you understand?" Naruto nodded his head slowly, earning a nod of understanding from the third as well. The third took Naruto's right hand and held it up. Examining it momentarily and running his thumb over the boy's palm, he then looked the youngster in the eyes. "You may not know it, but this right hand of yours, despite its misgivings and problems, may become something special one day. You have to learn from these problems that it gives you, and work your way around them." He then lowered the Jinchuriki's right hand and picked up his left, performing the same look over before enclosing the boy's fingers around the palm. "Your left hand possesses none of the problems the right one does. So learn to use techniques with your left instead of your right. Be creative." Naruto blinked and raised both his hands to look at them again. He made sure to give them a thorough examination himself, but then had his eyes stray to the scrolls he had deposited on the desk. His mind trailed over every possibility, accompanied with the new information he was receiving from the village leader. After one or two glances, Naruto then turned his attention back to the third Hokage to see him still smiling at him. The elder placed his hand on the Jinchuriki's head, in a comforting manner to ease the trials going through his mind. "I know you're a bright young boy, Naruto, one who is just beginning to discover his true potential. You just have to open yourself up a little bit more," Hiruzen exclaimed. "Try not to ask too many questions. If you can, try and answer them for yourself." The elderly shinobi then straightened up and took the pipe out of his mouth, blowing a ring of smoke into the airspace in front of him. He laughed quietly at his next thought, but made the following statement clear enough for his lowly, young audience to hear. Though the idea may sound a little bit far-fetched, why not? If you can't use ninjutsu with both hands, then try going through the seals with only your left hand and follow the processes from there. Who knows, if you can make it work, then you might just be able to perform ninja techniques yet. Naruto's eyes widened a little and looked down at the solitary hand in question. However, before he had a chance to explore this proposed concept, he was suddenly turned on his heels and hurried out of the room by the old cage. The village leader gently shuffled him out into the corridor, using the boy's stupor to gently comb him out of his hair. "Come on, lad, time to go home," Hiruzen chuckled. "You can practice the new techniques you've learned out on the field. I'm sure you've picked up one or two things from your many library excursions today." After being gently nudged out the door, the boy turned around to face his idol. When he craned his head upwards, the Jinchuriki was met with an amused smirk from the old man. "Try not to sneak into my house again, Naruto. I don't want the Anbu getting the wrong ideas. Go on now." Hiruzen gestured down the hall with a nod, indicating the general direction of exit from the premises. After a nod of understanding, Naruto then smiled and leapt at the old man, hugging him briefly. "Thank you, Oji-san. With a final exchange of smiles and a wave, the genin then hurried down the corridor and leapt out the nearest window. Not particularly the most civil way to exit a house, but it meant that he was punctually out of the Hokage's way for the time being. Hiruzen shared a quiet laugh after watching his unexpected guest vacate the area, and turned back to attend to the mess in his reading room. With his hands behind his back, he waddled over to the desk to collect the deposited scrolls. He only had to spare a brief glance down at the material laid out in front of him to determine that young Naruto had gone through quite a bit of the stuff from the vault. Most of the items of interest were based on unique hand seals and techniques that didn't require any seal weaving whatsoever, with some of the other titles being based on specialist techniques and tactics used only by the cages, but he figured they were nothing to be concerned about. Rolling up the ones that were open and collecting them in a bundle, along with the scroll of seals, the third prepared to take them back to the room they belonged to. However, just as he was picking up the last of the articles, he heard a shimmying of gentle footsteps behind him and quirked an eyebrow. The elder's movements stopped altogether when the floorboards behind him creaked at being treaded upon. He panned his head slightly. "Judging from the weight of your right foot, I can safely say that you are not the Naruto I saw 2 minutes ago," the third Hokage stated, and glared at the figure standing directly behind him. The darkened visage of an exact copy of Naruto, dropped in an aggressive stance and grinning widely, was an indication that this new visitor didn't intend on leaving without causing harm. Hiruzen's brow furrowed. "I take it you didn't drop by for a cup of tea?" "No, but I will have that scroll you're carrying," Naruto shouted and tossed a cluster of pellets on the ground. The tightly wrapped balls detonated simultaneously as the third Hokage wheeled around to face the enemy. However, due to the weight in his arms and probably a bad leg obtained from one of his past battles, he was unable to face his adversary quickly enough. He also made the mistake of breathing in the purple cloud of fumes that suddenly filled the room, and he soon found himself retching on the thick vapors. Seconds later, the old Hokage dropped to his knees, discarding the scrolls at the same time to stop his fall. He rested his upper body as best as he could on the desk chair while he continued to cough on the clouds filling his lungs. Tears welled up as a result of the gas and his face broke out into a sweat, the paralyzing agent quickly taking effect. Mustering up whatever strength he could, the elder glared up through a hazy vision at the Naruto copy strolling into view through the gas. "Take a nap, you old fart," the copycat exclaimed, swooping down and picking up the discarded scroll of seals. Hanging it from his shoulder, Naruto then stood straight up and flashed his headband at the shinobi hacking on the fumes. "You'll probably need one after this. So long." Performing a mock salute, the thief then turned and sprinted for the exit, eager to leave the premises and, by extension, the village before anyone caught wind of what has happened. Hiruzen gritted his teeth and tried to force himself up, but couldn't due to his muscle strength atrophying. See curses. Arg, his body weight seemed to increase tenfold. That Mizuki, damn him. Meanwhile, some ways down the road, Naruto had left the Hokage mansion willingly behind him, not only out of respect for his oldest and kindest mentor, but also to contemplate on what he was recently told by said elder. As he nudged past oblivious civilians down a lantern-lit street filled with clubs and restaurant, he was too busy staring intently down at his left hand to concentrate on anything else, whereas his right hand was slipped comfortably into his pocket. It was an odd sight, seeing a boy staring down at his hand while aimlessly following a random, busy road. Not to mention that he wasn't even changing his route for anything. A lot of the villagers out in the nightly air had to give the blonde troublemaker quite a wide berth, as the Jinchuriki had knocked over a noodle cart unintentionally, and had almost nearly walked into several transporters and couriers crisscrossing the boulevard. This lack of contact or attention gave the Jinchuriki the environment he needed to contemplate. Could that be the answer to my problem? Naruto blinked, and stopped in his tracks. If my right hand is preventing me from creating jutsu with both, then maybe I should just use my left hand to form the seals. I mean, the blonde paused for a moment in thought and looked up. Ahead of him, he saw Kotetsu and Izumo crossing the road to a pub on the other side of the street, with their respective arms around what Naruto suspected were their girlfriends. They were locked in deep, animated discussions with the admirable companions they were entertaining for the evening, and were looking quite happy. This didn't throw Naruto off one bit, as he chose to regard it as typical, off-duty shinobi time. I could probably be the first ninja in Konoha to be able to form hand seals with only one hand. Naruto fisted his left hand and thumped it into the air. I'll go back home and reread my copy of Hand Seal Basics. I'll just use the seals designed for the left hand and practice with them, then afterwards, maybe I'll try out some jutsu. With a new goal set and his resolve to learn ninjutsu strengthened, the smirking Jinchuriki turned heel and prepared to head back to his apartment. However, just as he turned around and began a hurried trek back down the avenue he had already marched, he violently and rather inadvertently ran into someone running in the opposite direction. Both Naruto and the runner roughly brushed by each other's left shoulders and slammed the opposing person in question around on a 180-degree turn. In the end, the two, headlong colliders ended up facing each other on their opponent's previous side of the footpath. Hey, watch why. Naruto was about to begin a confrontational argument, only to cut himself off when he realized that he was actually talking to himself. Literally. The newly made genin blinked in surprise as he stared at who he immediately discerned as a doppelganger, who was also glaring back at him in mild surprise. The copy's expression however changed when it also realized who it had bumped into, and stepped back a pace as the twin Narutos sized each other up. The real Jinchuriki looked his duplicate over from head to toe, taking note of the stance he had taken and also the strangely familiar object he had slung over his shoulder. What? Another me? Naruto remarked, before turning his attention to the giant scroll under his exact look-alikes arm. It only took him a couple of glances before he realized what the article actually was in the other boy's possession. The Jinchuriki jumped back somewhat and pointed accusingly at his mirror image with an angry scowl. You stole the scroll of seals. Stupid, loud-mouthed brat. The copy Naruto growled back, wrapping a protective arm around his package. At the same time, he looked around at the light crowd of villagers whom had suddenly stopped to look at the commotion starting up between the two hot-headed individuals. Great, first I try to pass myself off as the demon spawn, and then I run headlong into him. You, how? Grr? You snuck into Gigi's home and stole his scroll, didn't you? Naruto growled and dropped into a confrontational stance of his own. Give it back. Shut your mouth, you babbling moron. The copy shot back, now becoming increasingly weary of any shinobi that might be nearby. Don't think that you can stop me. If you get in my way, I'll cut you down. HMPH, Naruto huffed. You may look exactly like me, but your voice lacks the balance of seriousness and charisma that I have. There's no way I sound that brittle and threatening at the same time. The copy scowled even harder, and was preparing to draw a kunai when he caught onto the sight a series of shadows hopping across the rooftops in the distance. Glancing up, the fake Naruto tried to make out the fast-moving silhouettes and the direction they were heading in order to evaluate his situation. It took him only a moment of observation to realize that the squads of shinobi forces were running towards the Hokage mansion. Judging from the numbers, they must have picked up on the commotion from the sensors at HQ, or were maybe performing a routine checkup, he didn't know. All Naruto knew though was that something was going down, and with everything that has occurred so far, he was more or less leaning towards the idea that the squads of Anbu and Chunin were coming to their leader's aid. The real Naruto seemed to take notice of his doppelganger's attention lapsing, but ultimately decided to keep his eyes locked on him for the time being, instead of taking action. After all, he had no idea who the person impersonating him was and that if he acted irrationally, it would probably cost him. Damn it, the old man must have raised the alarm, the Naruto copy thought, shaking his head when he saw the shadows on the horizon disappear, and cursed his luck. I thought my gas had stunned him, but even as an old crock the geezer still has some energy to burn. Guess I underestimated him, not wanting to alert his presence to any possible eagle-eyed Anbu nearby as he had already done so with the villagers thanks to the untimely presence of the real Naruto. The copy decided to make a hasty retreat. The crowd around both him and the Jinchuriki had grown, and with the only shinobi for some ways being the genin in front of him, he figured that this was the best time for him to leave without being discovered. With a huff, he spun around and began to sprint away. Naruto, however, closed in on him in mere seconds just as he was making a break for it. The spiky-haired genin lunged out with his right hand extended and with a roar, grabbed hold of his doppelganger's arm. Hey, we're not done yet, you copycat. Naruto managed to stop his duplicate, his hand getting a good grip. However, the moment he made contact, an unexpected result occurred. A white puff of smoke exploded around and enveloped the Naruto double, surprising the original. Seconds later, after several surprised gasps from the surrounding villagers and some light coughing from the blonde genin, the cloud dissipated. When Naruto looked up at his quarry, he got quite a surprise when he found himself glaring up at none other than his other academy teacher Mizuki, who was looking down at him with a shocked look on his face.
That's all for now. If you want to see next part, then please like this video and subscribe my channel. Thank you.